Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this interview with Dr. Peter Doherty. Dr. Doherty and Dr. Rolf Zinkernagel were awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1996. This interview is one of a series called Legends in Veterinary Pathology, sponsored by the Charles Davis Foundation for Veterinary and Comparative Pathology. These interviews are intended to record some of the historical facts in the lives of these prominent veterinarians. Today is April 23, 2002. My name is Donald McGavin and I will be the moderator. And as the interview unfolds, it will become obvious that Dr. Doherty and I share some of the same cultural background. In fact, we were both born in the same state in Australia, namely Queensland, and grew up in Brisbane, the capital city of that state, and we went to the same veterinary school at the University of Queensland, albeit I preceded Dr. Doherty by 10 years. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for coming for this videotaped interview, and I think we probably should start with something about the history of the Doherty family. Australia's a nation of migrants, and
yes.
What's the story with your family?
The Doherty family, the Doherty part came to Australia in 1850, which would have been the first potato famine. Then my grandfather, who was a plumber, moved up to Queensland, the northern state, where he met my grandmother. There was a Catholic Protestant marriage, and I was actually brought up Protestant despite the name. They were on the gold fields at Charters Towers, and then had a shop down on the coast. But he died young. He died in 1918 of pneumonia, cardiovascular disease, so I never met him. I was born much later. Left the family in rather impecunious circumstances. Then my other grandparents, his wife, they were farming close to Brisbane, and the others came out from England in the early 20th century, from Essex.
And what's the story about your own family? You were born where?
I was born in Brisbane, and in the outer western suburbs of Brisbane, which is sort of a coastal city, subtropical. My dad was in the what was in the Postmaster General's department. They looked after the post office and telecommunications and all that sort of thing. Of course, it's now been privatised. He was in the telecommunications side. Had little formal education, left school at 15 because the family wasn't well off because my grandfather had died young. And my mother was a piano teacher. And so it was an interesting marriage. I mean, he was totally tone deaf. She loved music and played music. She was a piano teacher, but who hated to teach.
I see.
And so it was, unfortunately, I never learnt to play the piano, which is something I greatly regret. She let me off very easily because she didn't want to listen to me practicing. But growing up with that music was important, classical music. She was quite a talented musician.
And are you the only child, or do you have?
No, I have a younger brother who teaches high school science in Brisbane. Yeah.
So you essentially were born and went to the same school and lived in the same house for many years?
Yes. I grew up in the one house that was the house that my grandmother had built, actually, after her husband died. And then my father took it over. He was the youngest son, and he sort of cared for my grandmother, and they built a small house for her behind the house that I grew up in. She was a very devout Methodist. They were totally against alcohol. If my dad wanted to have a glass of beer, he had to sort of hide from her view and pretend that he didn't drink. So
the primary or the elementary school, as they would say here, you went to was?
It was called Corinda School. It was a state public school.
Yeah.
I attended there from the age I was about 5. There were no preschools at that stage. It was pretty primitive, really. It was an outer suburb, rather underdeveloped. The men that worked there were sort of clerical, working class people. They either went east by train to the city where they worked in offices and so forth, or they went west. There was a big railway workshop where they made railway carriages, and at that stage they still made steam engines and so forth in there. Now it's all, of course, diesel and everything's metal. The carriages were made of wood. They were beautiful objects.
So you, remember there was, in your time, was there an exam called the scholarship, which was the exam that allowed you to enter high
I
school?
was actually promoted very early in the school. I was born in 1940, and after the war, I guess it was to do with the baby boom, they actually promoted some of us very early. So at the age of 6, I sort of jumped a grade at school. So I finished my primary school and we took this examination called the scholarship. I just turned 13 and was pretty young. And that really gave you your future. If you passed the scholarship, you could go to high school free. Many of the kids left school at 14 and went to work in the local pig abattoir or something of that sort. And so it was pretty humble beginnings in a sense. And then I went to the local high school, which I had to go to by train. It was at Indooroopilly. It was some miles away, and we used to catch
the river, isn't it?
Yes, we'd catch a train for a sort of 15-minute train ride, and then walk up to the school. And it was the founding year of that school, so it was pretty primitive. There was they had good teachers, no library, no sporting equipment. The parents were expected to provide that, but that sort of really was a pretty primitive school in the sense of the usual resources you'd associate with a high school.
Well, the state used to have one high school. That was the Central, wasn't it? State High School.
Yes, it was
pretty
was
good.
the beginning. Queensland was a, as you know, a primary production state, and there'd been great resistance in Queensland to actually starting a university. They were afraid that the young men would turn into effete, white gloves, young aesthetes. That was the term, and they wouldn't go on to work in the agricultural property. So it was only until it was only in 1900 and I think about 1910 that the actual university started in Queensland, and then only on the they modelled it on the American A&M University, the Aggie University. So it was supposed to train people more or less for work in the industries that affected the state. But they had enough enlightenment to also set up a good humanities program. So it was a real university right from the outset.
So what was it like at Indooroopilly? It presumably got a bit better as the high school as the years went by. And
Well,
did you do junior, which was the exam after 2
yes,
years?
we had to do an examination called junior,
Yeah.
then an examination called senior, which was the university matriculation examination. Again, I was very young. I was by far the youngest in the class, and I was just 17 when I finished school at just 17 when I finished school. And then I went to university, and I went straight into the veterinary school. Of course, unlike the United States, where you go to college for 4 years and then you go to professional school, in the British system you go straight into professional school. And I had a scholarship from the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Stock, which required me to work for them for 5 years after I graduated. They paid my fees and gave me some sort of living allowance.
Well, actually, I have a little empathy for this because I had one of those too.
Yes.
But the only reason I think we had them was because if there was either to do this sort of indentured service, it's been used here in the US too.
Not such a bad idea, I think, because it was a way to get people to go and work out in those rural areas, and which are fairly tough. But everyone I know that had that experience of going out to work in the rural communities, whether it was medical graduate or veterinary graduate or dental graduate, they all look back on that with considerable nostalgia. It was a good experience and it broadened them. I actually didn't spend much time in the countryside. After I graduated, I came into the lab fairly quickly, but I think even the short time I spent working, say, in university vacations on the big sheep stations and so forth and cattle properties was a great experience.
Yeah, I'd like to pick that up with you and compare notes on that, but just a bit there. When we go back to this business of going to the university, I think you and I were faced with, we had to have some financial support to pay the fees and to help us. And of course there were medical, dental, veterinary, and I think forestry scholarships. Again, for this quote indentured service type. Did you make any sort of comparison between them and decide which you?
Well, it was sort of odd. I mean, my best subjects at school were actually the humanities subjects. I was quite competent in physics and chemistry and so forth, but my best subjects were English and French, and I write quite well. In fact, I think part of my scientific reputation rests on the fact that I can write fairly clearly, and I always stress that when I'm talking to young scientists. You must learn to write. But I wanted to do something. Though my sort of main talents were really literary. I thought of a career in journalism. I looked rather seriously at the idea of going to the National University in Canberra, where they were just starting to teach Asian languages. And some of the, they had this Asian language program, and some of the people that went through that then became, ended up later in their careers as ambassadors in China, and at a stage when the US didn't have an ambassador in China, Australia did. Some of them ended up at Harvard, international relations and all the rest of it. I also thought of journalism, and I was, the other thing, the engineering, telecommunications engineers got a fantastic scholarship that paid a lot of money. So I thought seriously about that, but I did a very poor mathematics paper in my final year, and I didn't get offered one of those. With the Queensland government, I was offered the choice. They thought this kid looks totally unsuitable for veterinary science. I was offered the choice of becoming a dentist, but I really didn't want to be what one of my medical cousins referred to as a monumental stonemason. So I went into the veterinary thing. It was a strange choice.
So did you apply for? You just applied for the veterinary.
The veterinary and the dental thing. I had second
both.
choice. I think, yeah, something like
Yeah,
that.
I understand. I think we probably should explain to people that Brisbane is on the same latitude as Palm Beach in Florida. That, of course, always sounds a lot better than saying it's on the same latitude as Houston. Of course, one's in the southern hemisphere and the other's in the northern, and the rest of the state then stretches down to, well, to Costa Rica and towards the Panama Canal. So we're talking about an area that runs from virtually the Florida-Georgia line, virtually almost down to the, not quite to the Panama Canal, and that's the place where we had these experiences. So where did you serve your time on the sheep ranch and the sheep station?
When I was a student, I was actually on a government research station called Gilruth Plains in Cunnamulla.
Oh, you went to Cunnamulla.
And so I was, they were conducting an enormous, there was the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, which was set up as the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research in the 20s, I think, by David Rivette. And it was really a pretty powerful government research organisation. In fact, that was one of the things that got me into science, because these guys were professional scientists. They were working on animal diseases, and I thought when I went to veterinary school, that'd be a good career to actually do research in animal disease. And so I actually went into the veterinary course with the idea of doing research, which is pretty unusual, I think.
I'm just a little surprised. CSIRO is federal, and we were in the state organisation.
Well, they didn't give any scholarships to CSIRO.
No, but did the when I did this, the state sort of mandated essentially that I go and work on a commercial ranch or something, but you were allowed to go on to...
Well, it was the job. I was actually went out onto this thing. You could work on a large animal property, and this one, I was paid as what's called a first-year jackaroo.
Yes.
This was a sort of an apprenticeship program to train young gentlemen to become managers of these large rural properties, because a lot of them were actually still at that stage controlled from Britain, and their management was in London with managers, sub-managers in Australia and so forth. So I was paid on that scale, which was a pretty small amount of money, and I actually worked as a station hand, and I spent some time mustering sheep and digging bore drains, you know, the big open drains that drain the water from the subartesian, so forth. And Cunnamulla is 600 miles west of Brisbane, so it's a pretty dry, hot place. It was quite an experience to be on. I was a very naive kid at that stage, 19, just turned 19, and I was brought up as a Methodist. I didn't drink, and by the time I'd been on that for 3 months, I think I was accustomed to drinking beer, and a lot of changes had happened in my life, not necessarily for the better, but still.
Was that the only one you worked on, or did you also work on a
No,
cattle?
I worked on a cattle property in the Brisbane Valley. I worked on a pig farm, and then I did time with vets on the Atherton tableland up north and down in South Australia. And
really?
the Barossa Valley, where they make a lot of the best wines in Australia.
That sounds like a delightful opportunity.
Well, it wasn't, because the guy I was working with was Methodist who didn't drink.
I see.
Yeah.
So, well, you must have had some experiences in the 5 years of the veterinary course. Well, let's start. You, I think, if I remember correctly, the physiology was in the medical school.
Yes. The great thing about the University of Queensland Veterinary School at that stage was it had quite a young faculty and quite a research-oriented faculty. The aim why the state had funded a veterinary school is they wanted to support research and have people who would service the big rural animal production industry. So it was very animal production oriented. It really wasn't oriented towards dogs and cats and so forth. And that part of the course was extremely badly taught, in fact. It had the great virtue that the first 3 years of the course, they used the full resources of the university. And so physiology was taught through the physiology department, which also taught the medical students, biochemistry the same. Anatomy was in the veterinary school. It was a veterinary subject. We did first year botany and zoology and did the same as the science students did. So we got a very good scientific background. And then on top of that, because the veterinary school was very interested in animal production systems, we had courses in things like statistics, which was something totally unknown in a medical school, and in genetics. And we did a lot of population genetics, and I read, for instance, some of the early population genetics, Fisher and so forth, and we were using those tests and doing statistical analysis with hand-cranked facet calculators, you know, putting in a t-test into a facet calculator, pull the handle. And so that actually left its impression on me. And genetics and statistics and so forth is the way I've tended to approach science. And of course, genetics is by far the most powerful scientific discipline there is, and now it's molecular genetics, but it's always been powerful.
Well, what people are we talking about? Who was the geneticist in those days?
Glenn McBride was the geneticist. He was he'd worked at the Institute of Animal Genetics in Edinburgh and early on, where my wife later worked when we went to Edinburgh for a time before we had kids, and also there were some quite distinguished scientists in the veterinary school. It was John Sprent, who was an early pupil of Tolliver, the American immunologist, and was a parasite guy and built a very strong parasitology department. I thought I'd become a parasitologist when I was going through, because the CSIRO lab in Brisbane was very strong in parasitology. Sprent taught a very interesting course in pathogenesis mechanisms and immunity, which really turned me on. But he left to the rest of his department, they taught a parasitology course, which was all morphological and descriptive. And I thought, after I'd done that, I wanted nothing to do with parasitology. I thought this is the most boring, categorizing subject, and I didn't want to do it. Also, John Francis, who headed the microbiology program, had in his day been a very good scientist. He didn't pursue science himself after he came to the Queensland Vet School. He was more interested in cattle breeding and that sort of thing, but he built a strong research-based department and encouraged research. And I think that atmosphere was terrific, and it was fairly unusual at that time.
Well, I think we should mention too that Dr. Sprent actually received the gold medal from the American Parasitological Society in 1962, I think. Yeah.
Really?
Yes, and he was, and then his son you knew.
I know John Sprent very well. His son, who's a very prominent immunologist, he and I share the distinction with Fellows of the Royal Society of London, for instance, which is the accolade for science. It's like being a member of the National Academy of Sciences here. John is a great scientist, and his father, until very recently, was still doing science. In his 80s, he was still had a little grant, and he was still doing parasite life cycles. And the one thing I remember about Sprent was that I was tremendously turned on by his subject, and I write very badly. I write much quicker than I think much quicker than I can write, and I'm trying to get it down, so my handwriting is appalling. The invention of the word processor has been just an enormous benefit for me. And I wrote this paper for Sprent, and he couldn't read a word of it. And so I had to come in and actually read the paper back to him. And that's what he remembers me for, actually coming in and reading this paper back, or remembers me as an undergraduate for that.
This is actually the final exam paper, right?
Yeah, it's the final exam paper. And then we did 3 years of science. Pathology was well taught by Hans Winter and Alan Seawright, who was a very research-oriented pathologist interested in toxicology, a fine scientist, actually. And the last couple of years were rather clinical, and I really wasn't very interested, and it wasn't particularly well taught. But it just that sort of softness of the sort of clinical world didn't appeal to me. I like a much more somewhere I can really get into it. I'm sort of a natural pathologist, I guess, in that sense.
Well, after 5 years, the moment of truth came.
Yeah.
You had been paid, and now was the time to
Yes,
pay the
that's
piper.
right.
You had sold your soul to the devil, and you had to now be at the disposal of the Queensland Department of
Yes,
Agriculture,
that's
and
right.
they wanted their pound of flesh.
Exactly, and they got it.
What
And,
happened?
well, I told them I wanted to go into the lab, and they thought, well, you know, I was just a pretty young guy, and they thought, well, it'll do this guy good to go to the country for a while. So they sent me to Toowoomba, which is a fairly close town, and I worked for a while there as a regional veterinary officer, and did a lot of post-mortems in the field. My most successful post-mortem was done during that period. I went out to post-mortem a cow, and this cow had died on the property, and the guy called up and he wanted to get a post-mortem, and of course the Rural Veterinary Service did that because they were always looking for dangerous diseases, so to speak. And so I went out there, and here I'm totally callow youth, and this guy, and as a crusty old farmer, looked at me with total contempt and took me to the cow, which was a very dead cow. And so I opened it up, and there, sticking out of its heart, was a bag needle. It had died from hardware disease, and the needle had gone up through the thing. So I just pointed it out to him and said, this is why a cow died. He was really quite impressed. I've never done anything quite so good as a gross pathology exam again. And they also had me doing some sort of fertility survey, and I think because I was fairly interested in what I was doing, I was sending a fair number of specimens back to the diagnostic vet lab, and they had me do this thing. They thought they'd eradicated trichomoniasis from this area, and I think the third herd I visited, I isolated trichomoniasis. So I think they decided I was too dangerous to leave in the field, and they brought me back to the lab fairly soon.
So you got back, and the lab, of course, is Animal Research Institute
In Brisbane,
at Urongpilly in Brisbane, and that was really had a lot of strengths in those days, didn't it?
Yes, it was a very good diagnostic veterinary lab. It did diagnostic pathology, and its bacteriology was terrific under Jeff Simmons, and it was really a good institution. But I sort of realized fairly quickly I didn't want to do diagnostic work for my career. I mean, it's a challenge that appeals to some people. It didn't appeal to me. I like to follow something along and go into depth. And part of the reason they brought me back to the lab was they had money to do a research project on leptospirosis in cattle. They wanted they'd inherited a farm which was going to be flooded, and they decided to do a field science study of a leptospira outbreak. And so the idea was I would infect some cattle and then watch it spread and study the consequences and see whether it got into the wildlife and all the rest of it. And I did that and actually wrote it up for a master's thesis from the university.
So how long did that all last from start to finish?
Oh, that was about, I suppose, about 18 months, 2 years in the most.
Yeah.
And during that time I met my wife, who was working there, Penny Stevens, and we married. So she actually typed the thesis. She can remember that, and multiple carbon copies and all that sort of stuff. And, yeah.
I smiled because I had the same experience.
Yes.
My fiancée also typed mine in those days.
Right,
It's
right.
just wonderful, the
Yeah,
parallels. I think
guys,
it shows the economic...
I mean, guys couldn't type. I mean, I don't know
restrictions.
why Penny could type. I mean, she'd been to a much better school than I had, and she came from a much more middle-class sort of background.
Well, you, because that lepto work had gone on for years there, both at Urongpilly.
Yes, yeah.
In fact, there's one famous story there when they started. They had these pigs in those concrete pens down the back, and they had this fellow who used to wash them out all the time, and of course these female pigs would urinate, and this urine would come out and hit the concrete, splash,
vaporize, yeah,
and vaporize,
sure.
and aerosolize, and of course this fellow came down with lepto, almost undoubtedly by, through mucus, transmucus.
And that was probably the main means of transmission in the cattle too.
Oh, really?
So, they were coming into a concrete yard every day and urinating, and you're getting but I didn't get an antibody titer to lepto, so I didn't get it. Yeah.
Well, that project came to an end.
Yes, and then they wanted to set up a diagnostic virology, tissue culture type virology thing. So they sent me down to Melbourne to get some training in that, which I did, and came back and established a sort of tissue culture type virus diagnostic thing, which I didn't, again, I didn't enjoy. I mean, I just don't enjoy that sort of activity. And I know it's a detective game, but it wasn't my detective game. My detective game was to actually study something in a more depth. And so I did some research and published some little papers during that time. And then, but after several years, I realized it was really time for me to move on. I applied for a PhD scholarship at the National University, where I wanted to work with a guy called Cedric Mims, who worked on pathogenesis of infections. And Cedric at that time had a student, and they turned me down because he'd only take one student at a time. He was an interesting character, and said apply again next year. And in the meantime, John Roberts, who was also a vet, who'd worked with Mims, in fact, for his PhD, just come back to Australia from Cornell, where he'd done a postdoc. And I was talking with him, and he said, well, a place you should think about is the Morden Institute in Edinburgh, because they have an experimental pathology program, and you can do some quite nice research. And so I said, oh, fine, and I thought of writing to them, and then the next week there was a job advertised in the journal Nature for an experimental pathologist at the Morden Institute. And I applied to that. I asked you to write me a reference, as you may recall, and you did, and they offered me the job. So I had to pay off the last part of my bond to the Queensland government, which was a few $100s at that stage. Penny reminds me that I used her money to do it. And then we went off to Britain, and I worked at the Morden. Yeah.
So that was a complete change in climate then?
Yes, I'd learnt virology and
just amplify a little bit on the Melbourne thing, because knowing you, I suspect it gave you some background into just, I mean, you didn't
well,
go
what
there
I
just
did,
to,
no, what I did is they sent me down to work with at the Commonwealth Serum Labs with a guy called John White, who was a nice guy, and they taught me some stuff. There was also a very strong veterinary program headed by Eric French in the CSIRO lab in Melbourne, which later was the group which was to give rise to the Geelong Veterinary Lab. And Bill Snowden, who became the first director of the Geelong Veterinary Lab, was working there at the time, and there was Eric, who'd worked with Macfarlane Burnett as a virologist, and when Burnett, who was the director of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in Melbourne, the really famous Australian Research Institute, and who was a virologist, decided to switch all his effort into immunology in the 50s, I guess. He told the virologists they either had to become immunologists or leave. So Eric had left, and he'd joined the CSIRO and established their veterinary virology research, and they isolated a number of viruses and so forth. And I think the Queenslanders didn't want me to work with him because they were afraid he'd steal. They were afraid he'd steal me. I suppose I should feel flattered, but I did go and work with Eric for a while and got to know those people. And in fact, when later I was to return from the experience in Edinburgh, I was offered a job as a senior veterinary research scientist in the CSIRO with Eric French's group. But in the meantime, I realised I didn't know any immunology, and so I actually went back to the National University. That's a bit later in the story, but I kept the contacts with that group, and I actually thought that I would spend my career probably in the CSIRO, and if I'd continued with that, I would have ended up in that big veterinary laboratory in Geelong, which would have had its compensations. You can live at some rather nice beach areas and work in that lab.
So I presume the trip to England was on
Scotland.
Sorry.
Scotland is not in England, and McGavin should know that.
They're from Galloway.
Yes.
Yes,
which is also in Scotland.
It's under the stress of the unedited tape.
Must be.
But did you take a ship?
Yes, we sailed on a ship. We thought we needed a vacation. We were just married, not too long, and Penny was pregnant, and we thought we'd go to Britain by ship because it would be a cheap vacation. And we at that stage they were still bringing large numbers of immigrants to Australia by ship, and they'd sail these ships out to Australia, and they would disgorge the immigrants, and then you get a pretty cheap passage back. So we travelled back on this ship called the Australis. It was run by the Greek Chandris lines. It was terrible. I mean, I was on that. We were on that ship for 6 weeks, and I've refused to go on a ship. There is no way I would go on a ship for a vacation. It's just.
Did it go through the Panama?
It went through the Panama Canal.
The Panama Canal. Oh, okay.
Went across the Pacific. It went to Fiji and Bilbao and Panama. It went through the Panama Canal, which was the best part of it, going through the Panama Canal. That was spectacular. And then we stopped briefly at Fort Lauderdale, which is the first time I ever set foot in the United States, and then on up to Southampton. And we were on it for 6 weeks, and it was full of people who were going to this was in 1967, they were going to the Holy Land with a group called the Australian Christian Tourism Group. Very earnest group of geriatrics, some of whom died on the way. And they would have hit the Holy Land right when the 6 Day War started, so I have no idea what happened to them. I've never been so glad to get off anything as I like jumbo jets. I mean, I think 747s are infinitely preferable.
Well,
The romance of being on a ship is, that wasn't romantic.
I have little understanding. It took us 4 weeks to get from Australia to the west coast of the US.
Yeah.
I remember the old song about I joined the Navy to see the world. And what did I see? I saw the sea.
Yeah, we mostly saw sea too.
So you hit UK and then what, proceeded?
We took the Flying Scotsman up to Edinburgh.
Was it still going then, was it?
Yeah, sure. And we had trouble finding somewhere to live, actually. It was very hard to find accommodation. We eventually found a place, and in fact, the place we eventually ended up was the top floor of an old 3-story Victorian house just out of the west end of Edinburgh, over the Dean Bridge. And they took me because when I sort of contacted them, I sent them a letter. They'd advertised that they had an apartment vacant, and an Australian with a name like Doherty, they thought I must be a rugby player because the guy who owned the apartment was actually very active in rugby in Edinburgh, and they wanted to get, they had an amateur team, and they thought I might be an asset. Of course, I'm not a rugby player. I'm not built like a rugby player. I never was. But I think when they met us and they realised, I think the penny charmed them actually, and so they gave us the apartment anyway. So, and we spent about 5 years there.
5 years.
Yeah.
Well, then you had to settle down to the Scottish scene, and
well, it was great. I mean, I love Scotland, and we didn't have much money. We bought a little car, and we would take our vacations with a tent around Europe, or later we had a combi van when we had kids. We had, both our children were born at Edinburgh, the Western General Hospital, and I worked in the Department of Experimental Pathology at the Morden Institute.
Where's that located in relation?
It was out in
downtown?
Gilmerton, which was a suburb on the other side of Edinburgh. Of course, Edinburgh is very small. I could either drive out there or get there by bus. It was headed, the department was headed by Dick Barlow, who taught me to be a neuropathologist. And what I did is I enrolled at the University of Edinburgh as a part-time PhD student. Dick, and I also did the diagnostic neuropathology for the Scottish Veterinary Investigation Service under Dick's supervision. So I learnt neuropath in sheep and cattle and so forth, and worked on Laupingal infection, tick-borne encephalitis virus as my PhD thesis. And basically did pathology and electron microscopy and a lot of different differential stains and all that sort of thing, which were very much a feature of Scottish pathology. I mean, been very much influenced by Lendrum from Dundee, I think, who was very into differential stains and all that sort of thing. It was rather a traditional sort of pathology. The pathology I really should have been in, I think, was really the sort of Florey type pathology, the experimental pathology, which was more the English approach to pathology. But I learnt a lot and it was fun.
Well, there must always be a few rough times with neuropath. I mean, those are, you know.
Well,
so to tell us about, you know, who else was there, how many people, what sort of load was there?
Well, it wasn't an
pressure?
enormous load. It took about, I think it took about a quarter of my time. And of course, Barlow was always there to ask, and he was a terrific pathologist. So it wasn't too heavy. And then as time went by, other people took on the diagnostic part, and I concentrated on the research. I mean, Kevin Morgan came. He was recruited as a young pathologist. He later became a board-certified American College of Pathology guy and works in the United States. And I worked with Hugh Fraser, who was doing all the scrapie research at that stage with Alan Dickinson, who was at the Institute of Animal Genetics, not the Institute of Animal Genetics, the ARC Institute, Agricultural Research Council Institute for Genetics in Edinburgh. And they did the best scrapie work pre-prion, actually. They did very systematic studies of genetic differences and genetic effects in the scrapie system. And Hugh was a good friend, and then my research I did in collaboration with Hugh Reid, who he was doing the virology serology side of things. The most important thing we found really was there's a lot of local antibody production in the brain of these sheep. The B cells go into the brain, the plasma cells make antibody there, and we showed that pretty nicely actually by doing cerebrospinal fluid antibody levels and using marker antibodies. The other thing that happened to me at that stage is I actually caught Laupingal. Did you really? Well, I was injecting the sheep with virus, and it was I had one of the shepherds in the Morden helped me to inject the sheep. So I had a big syringe full of virus, and the shepherds in Scotland were called Lucas, Lucas. They look after the sheep.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And his name was Jum.
Uh-huh.
Jum. And Jum would say things. He was from the Highlands. He was a Heelan man. And he would say, if he wanted to say, he'd meet me up by the sheep pen, he would say, well, I be away up by the new. And so I learned to speak the language to some extent. And anyway, we were injecting these sheep, and I was in a bit of a hurry because I knew he wanted to get off and get his lunch. And actually, I had the syringe with the cap off, and one of the sheep bumped my arm, and I just grazed my finger. And we were doing this pathogenesis study, which really required when the sheep got sick, we would bleed them out, and we'd take the cerebrospinal fluid, perfuse their brain and spinal cord, take the samples, and of course you get an enormous amount of material, and we had vast amounts of material to look at from a series of about 20 sheep. And so I didn't know whether I'd actually contracted this thing or not. I mean, it was just a little scratch. And so I started to take my temperature. And I had one of the local docs bled me. And after about 4 days, my temperature just shot up like that. And I said, well, you know, I got this thing. They had a bed ready for me at the infirmary in Edinburgh, the hospital. And I was all set to go in there if I got any neurological symptoms, because I'd had some quite severe cases of Laupingal. I didn't get symptoms. I just got febrile, felt rather dull for a couple of weeks, stayed home, took it very quietly. Hugh Reid isolated the virus from my successive blood samples, and we watched the increasing antibody levels. And I got better. And then after that, a couple of other people at the Moordun caught Laupingal from some using rather poor technique, actually, in handling some infected mice. And I wrote it up for the Lancet, so it's a letter to the Lancet, and it's the only thing I've ever been in where I'm I'm part of Table 1.
Was there a previous historical evidence or?
Oh yeah, there were a number of cases of Laupingal over the years, all in laboratory people.
Right. And
they'd had some very severe cases in, I think it was Wellcome, where they made the vaccine. The vaccine was made by grinding up brain. I'm not sure whether they were using mouse brain or sheep brain at that stage, and inactivating it with formalin and then clarifying it. So it was a primitive type vaccine that had been developed at the Moordun in the 1920s and 30s, and it worked quite well. When they were making that vaccine, they made that vaccine at the Moordun for many years. They would take the brains of the sheep out, they would infect the sheep, and then intracerebrally, and they would take the brains out after 5 or 6 days, grind them up and activate with formalin. And then the carcasses would go for human consumption.
Yes.
It's unbelievable, but it's true. And also they actually spread scrapie all around the place, because they by mistake, when the director, J. Russell Gregg, this is in the 30s, was on away at a conference or on vacation or something, they by mistake took some of the sheep he'd infected with scrapie. And of course formalin doesn't inactivate scrapie, and they spread scrapie all over the place. Yeah,
there's stories about that.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about this work, and in the papers you wrote, sort of almost ironic, is that you in fact did the morphologic pathology.
Yes, that's right.
And somebody else did the immunological side of it.
Yeah, he was doing the antibody side of it.
Right.
What he was doing was basically virus neutralization tests, which meant a plaque assay, and he was in the microbiology thing, and I was in pathology. So he was the immunologist, and I was the pathologist. And, but you know, my interest has been in cell-mediated immunity, so you know that's not so logical, and that really got me very interested in inflammation and what happens in inflammatory pathology and how it works and so forth. And that's really what led me in to the next phase of my career when I came back to Australia.
We'll just talk a little bit about the methodology in here. You have referred to it elsewhere about the cells in the CSF and how it helped when you.
Well, that was after I went back to Canberra, to the National University. And what happened was we thought we probably should go back to Australia. We'd always intended to. And Eric French visited, and I was in contact with Eric, and they were offering me a senior scientific officer in the CSIRO. All the time I'd been in the Moordun, I was actually a senior scientific officer in the British Civil Service. I was never a PhD student in the formal sense. I was first a senior scientific officer, and I think they changed the title to senior veterinary research officer or something of that sort. So I'd always been employed. I mean, as a senior scientific officer in the British Civil Service, I had certain rights and privileges. One right that I had was if I was travelling by train through a mining area, and there was no first-class compartment, I had the right to have a carriage attached to the train for my purpose. Really? So, you know, there were these odd and strange, arcane things written into British Civil Service life. The Mordana actually was a private research institute, but it got a lot of funding from the Scottish Department of Agriculture, and that was monitored by the Agriculture Research Council. We had a patron, the Duke of Buccleuch, an enormously wealthy man who has the feudal rights to most of Edinburgh, and he got few duties. Every property owner paid several pounds a year to the Duke of Buccleuch, so he's extremely wealthy and powerful Duke. We had to call him Your Grace when we saw him at the annual garden party every year. It's not very easy for an Australian to call anybody Your Grace. I mean, it's about as easy as it is for an American, but that's what we were supposed to do. So it was interesting being there. And also Cedric Mims came through and visited because he knew I was interested in working with him, and he was interested in the work I've been doing with Laupinghill. Also Neil Nathanson from Hopkins came through, and that was the other great neuropathology pathogenesis group. There was Mims, who was a pathogenesis guy, not necessarily in the neuroscience side. He was more interested in hepatic disease and pox viruses and macrophages and that sort of thing. But the group in Hopkins was the group that was started, I guess, went back to David Bodian. And Bodian was actually the first person to report evidence from monkey experiments with poliovirus that there was probably antibody production in the brain. Really? And so Nathanson sort of inherited that tradition. Neil, of course, eventually ended up, he was professor of microbiology at University of Pennsylvania when I was there, and then he eventually ended up as the AIDS czar. And Neil's still active. He's still actually the, I think, VP for Research or Dean for Research or something at Penn. Great guy. And so various people would come through this place because it was really quite a prominent thing on the neuropath community. My meetings that I would go to when I was in those 5 years in Edinburgh, I would go to the International Neuropathology meetings, the British Neuropath Society, and the Association of Veterinary Teachers and Research Workers. That was an annual meeting that was always in Scarborough, which is in the Grand Hotel, one of these old Victorian hotels where people used to go by train to have their vacation in the British summer, and it would be the Yorkshire wool growers and so forth and wool buyers who would go to this hotel. And it was perched on the cliff above Scarborough. We would often follow, it was a week-long meeting, we would often follow the British Labour Party conference, which was held there.
Was this before the days of having it at Blackpool? I thought Blackpool...
They sometimes had it at Blackpool, they sometimes had it in Scarborough. And the vets had the reputation that about a fifth as many people would drink just as much beer as the Labour Party. So that's not unfamiliar for the vets, I think. So it was fun, yeah.
Well, we're probably rolling down a bit in time, but for the end of this tape, but just give us some feeling about ordinary domestic things in Edinburgh. I mean, how much did you have time to see your family? Did you have...
We didn't see our family because, of course, well, my brother came across and worked in Britain for a time, so we saw him and his wife, and various of the family visited. We didn't go back to Australia in all those 5 years, and making an international telephone call at that stage was quite a business. You'd do it about once a year. So there are a lot of letters written, which is rather good, actually, because the letters my wife wrote to her mother and the letters that she wrote back are one of our best records of that time. So we have quite a good personal record. My records will go into the National Library of Australia, and that'll be part of the archive that goes in. And we had our 2 children when I was there. My wife worked for a time at the Institute of Animal Genetics. She was first author on a paper that mapped part of the E. coli genome, working with Eric Reeve. And then after our kids were born, she quit and she looked after the kids. We took a number of holidays in Europe, travelling around and camping, and in Scandinavia, Germany.
Well, you had some French, Italy. I think, did you? Did you have some French too?
Yes, I have some French, but my French I learned in Australia from a Scotsman, so my accent is pretty terrible. Yeah,
for which they would be very sensitive. So, but what was the stress of life like? Just, as a working like this, doing the thesis work. You're familiar with the
Well,
American
it was
situation.
a different world. I mean, it's firstly Britain and America are very different, and the British approach to science is really you can have a lifetime reputation from just doing one or two very good things. I mean, the Americans are always saying, so he won the Nobel Prize last week, what is he doing now? That sort of thing. And it was much less, much more informal and casual in a sense. So I was working hard and doing a lot, but there was none of that sort of sense that you had to conform to some sort of model. I mean, for instance, one of my friends told me that he was at one of the vet schools and doing a PhD, and it was expected that the students would be in at night. So it didn't actually matter if you were there, but what you had to do was have your car in the parking lot. And so you could park your car in the parking lot and then go and do something else. Nobody bothered. But there was this sort of expectation and so forth. I actually tell postdocs and graduate students that you can work too hard. If you spend too much time working, you'll become rather stupid. You need time to think. And we don't think enough. I'm an experimentalist, and I'd say if I look back on my career, I'd say the thing I've done is too many experiments and not enough thinking. And I think that's true of most experimentalists.
So the great day came when you were going to move back. So there must have been a history
Yes.
behind how you looked for a job. And
well, I was set to go back to the veterinary lab.
this is the one in Melbourne.
Yeah, and
CSIRO.
then I went to hear a talk. I thought I understood something about immunology, and I went to hear a talk by the British scientist Mel Greaves. He came up to Edinburgh to speak at a thing called the Metchnikoff Club, which was run by a pathologist called Angus Stewart and an immunologist called Spedding Micklem. Delightful guys, both of them. I think Spedding is still around, but I think Angus died. And I lost touch with him. Angus worked on macrophages. And so that was why it was called Metchnikoff.
Seems appropriate for Metchnikoff.
And but they brought Mel through, and he spoke about T cells. I thought, well, I don't know any of this. I really need to know this stuff. And so just at that time, the group in Canberra, Bob Blandon, working with Cedric Mims, and it was actually Frank Fenner's last graduate student, was doing T cell transfer experiments showing clearance of ectromelia virus was mediated by T cells. And so I applied for a short-term position there, and I essentially got a postdoc to go there. I was already a couple of years postdoctoral, but went back there, and I was on a non-tenured position, essentially initially a postdoc, and then as a research fellow, which is a 5-year non-tenured type research contract. And the idea was I'd learn immunology, learn this sort of immunology. I talked about it with Eric French, and then I would come and work in the CSIRO.
So, but you arranged this from Scotland.
I arranged it from Scotland.
So how did you just, you did that by...
No, I was in contact with Mims. Mims had visited.
Right.
French had visited, so I applied. I'd talked to Mims, and then almost the next month there was a job advertised, and I applied for it. It wasn't actually meant for me, it was meant for Blandon, who'd just finished his PhD. But they sort of found some money for me and gave me initially a 2-year postdoc. And so I thought, well, that's fine with me. I just want to do this for a while, and then I'll go and work for the CSIRO. And so I went back there and started to do the research. And
you and the wife and the 2 kids went down and got on the ship.
Yeah, no, we went by plane. There's no way we were going to go ship. And so we actually flew back. We flew back through, we visited some friends in Greece that we'd made, a neurosurgeon and his wife who had kids and who'd lived just down the street from us. And so we went to Athens and we visited them with our 2 little boys. I mean, and then we went to see a friend of mine. We flew from Athens, I think, to Hong Kong to see a friend of mine who was a lawyer, parliamentary draftsman, in fact, who was in the colonial service in Hong Kong.
This is what year now?
This is end of 1971.
Okay.
And then when we got back to, then eventually we got on a Boeing 707 and we flew down to Australia with Qantas and landed. And landed in I guess we came into Brisbane, I think. Yeah.
But did you disembark there and stay with your family?
Oh yeah, we stayed with the family.
Stayed with your family.
So we had Christmas with the family, and then we went down to Canberra and started the job in Canberra. And so that's where my life was to change, and I was to become a medical research worker rather than a veterinary research worker. I've been doing veterinary research ever since I graduated, pretty much, except for 3 months in the field. I'd worked on leptospirosis, virus infections, and then on neuropathology and Lauping and so forth in Britain. So I'd done 9 years of veterinary research. It was my 31st year, I guess, when I moved back. 32nd year. I was just turned 31, and came back to Canberra. And very much changed, I think, by the experience of being in Europe, by the experience of travelling around Europe. We spent a lot of time in art galleries and looking at various places. We climbed up every ruined Pile Tower and castle in
You haven't
Scotland.
mentioned which parts of country of Europe this was that you went. Which?
Well, no, we did one trip. We went right down to the south. We got down as far as Pompeii, and it was shut. So I still haven't been to Pompeii. It was actually a holiday, and so Venice I remember very vividly.
This was all
Florence. Yeah.
Driving on the wrong side of the road.
Yeah. We had a little British car, a Hillman Imp, which
yes.
we were driving on the wrong side of the road, and then back to Britain. And then we had a combi camper van, an old Volkswagen bus thing.
Right.
Must have been the slowest vehicle in Europe, I think. 1200cc engine and a combi van, so a real hippie sort of a vehicle. Yeah. So it was good for transporting small children.
Yes, it was.
Mm.
I'm trying to think of, we really should try to sum up this segment.
Yeah,
And,
well, it's really...
You want to give some thoughts on, this is the end of your, at least your formal higher degree part of your life, and you're about to go.
Yeah, but I really
postdoc.
hadn't done any sort of higher degree studies in the sense of doing examinations. I haven't done a formal examination since I was 22 years old, and I really did my own thing scientifically. I was never really supervised, and maybe that's a bad thing, and I probably should have had some more coursework and all that sort of thing, but I didn't. When I was in Edinburgh, my formal supervisor was the professor of pathology in the university, who was called George Montgomery. A charming man, and I don't actually know what he did in pathology, but he was very well liked and thought of.
This is in the medical school.
In the medical school.
Right.
So I would go along and see Professor Montgomery once a year and tell him what I was doing. He would say, well, that's very interesting. And that was it. That was my supervision. Dick Barlow taught me how to write a scientific paper, to take out a lot of the flowery language, be concise, and I wrote in a very, very concise style for a number of years until I came to the United States, and then that's helped to ruin my writing style to some extent. I've become more verbose again. But that was a good discipline. And I learned how to do pathology. I already knew how to do a scientific experiment, and they're the essential things you need to know to do science.
Well, what actually, we hear some horror stories about the British examination of the thesis, where they languish for years. I mean, I can think of one.
No, it was examined quite quickly.
So what was the procedure? I mean, if I remember correctly,
you submitted the thesis, and
it had to be bound when it was submitted.
It was bound when it was submitted. It went to, I think, 2 internal and 1 external examiner in the university. The external was Bill Jarrett, the pathologist from Glasgow.
Right.
And Bill was, he was well known for his leukemia research, and actually had a lot of American connection with that, and was doing NIH-funded research for part of it. And so he read the thesis, and I went across to Glasgow for an oral examination, and after that, I think we drank a lot of beer, and that was it. So it was pretty casual and informal. The veterinary world's pretty informal, actually, especially in Britain. So,
yeah, that seems to be so.
Yeah. So I'm badly trained, but never been through the right courses or any of that sort of thing.
Well, you're actually an example of what to do if what has happened is an indication.
I think I think my career has been so unusual and so idiosyncratic that it's really a sort of an unusual career path. And I guess the fact that I'm the first vet to win the Nobel Prize sort of says something about that. I'm not sure that it's. I don't think I wouldn't recommend anyone trying to take that path. But I suppose what it teaches you is that there are many different ways of getting there. And actually, even though I spent that time 9 years doing research, many of my medical colleagues really haven't started in research until their early 30s. So by the time I was 31, I'd already published a fairly substantial body of work, and I was pretty experienced. And yet many of my colleagues who, say, did a college degree, and an MD, and then physician training, often don't start in research until their early 30s. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think this is probably a good time to stop the first part of the interview. And then when we come back, we'll move on to life in Australia and what happened
Canberra.
then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, Peter, you've arrived back in Australia with your wife and 2 children. You've finished your PhD, done some research, and you're about to move into a new phase.
Yeah, well, I'd come back to work with Cedric Mims, but Mims had already told me that he might leave. He was looking, he'd had hoped, I think, to succeed the previous chair of microbiology, who was Frank Fenner, who's a very famous Australian virologist. And instead they'd chosen Gordon Ada from the Hall Institute to be the chair, and Gordon had come up there, and I think Cedric felt a bit put out, and so he was offered the chair of microbiology at Guy's Hospital Medical School, and he was still debating that, but by the time I'd got there he decided to leave, and I arrived there about December 1971. I think he left about mid-1972. So we worked together for a short time, but not for very long. I wanted to follow up on the inflammatory pathology thing and to learn cellular immunology, T-cell immunology as it then was. He was working with lymphocytic choriomeningitis virus, which is a very nice experimental model, but it's also can be quite a severe human disease. And I'd got a hell of a fright when I was in Edinburgh when I injected myself with Laupingill virus, and I didn't really want to give myself something else. And so I started instead to work with a thing called Semliki forest virus, which is the particular variant they had was a very virulent virus and killed mice rather quickly. It turned out not to be a good model for what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was to initially just start to quantify the inflammatory process. And the way I was going to do this is because when I was in Edinburgh, right at the end of the time, a guy called Richard Karp from the Staten Island rather, lab of the New York State Health Department, where in fact a lot of the early LCM virus, lymphocytic choriomeningitis virus work was done in the State Health Department by John Hodgson many years before, though not at Staten Island. But the place where Richard was working was the psychiatry place, and he was studying scrapie in mice, and he developed a technique to get cerebrospinal fluid from mice and was doing biochemical studies on the cerebrospinal fluid. He showed me that technique, and I thought, well, if I can get small amounts of cerebrospinal fluid from mice, I can actually count the numbers of cells in a meningitis. And so I tried this stuff with Semliki forest virus, but it wasn't very good for studying T-cell responses because the virus itself does so much damage. There's a tremendous non-specific inflammatory exudate, macrophages and so forth come flooding in.
You'd break your blood-brain barrier,
and
wouldn't
so it wasn't useful for that sort of study. So I wrote one paper on it, which was published in the American Journal of Pathology, and then decided I'd better work with the LCM virus. And LCM virus had the advantage that it's not a lytic virus. It's normally carried in nature as an inapparent infection in utero. It's contracted in utero, and then mice carry it all their life. They pass it on to their progeny. So it doesn't kill cells at all. And what actually kills mice is when the virus is injected into the brain and the immune response gets underway and it kills the mice. And that was known. It was known from the work of initially Eric Traub, who'd worked out the nature of the persistent infection and the epidemiology, and then John Hodgson in New York and Wally Rowe at NIH had sort of shown that it was an immunopathology. And then about the time that I started in Canberra, Don Gilden, working with Neil Nathanson and Jerry Cole at Hopkins, had done cell transfer experiments and showed that immune cells actually do induce the disease. So that's the stage I was at when I started on this stuff. And so we came to Canberra. We were housed in what was called the Hughes Ghetto, which was a select set of little duplexes in the suburb of Hughes in Canberra, where graduate students and postdocs and junior non-tenured people lived. It was university-owned housing. It was sort of a loop street. On the outer side of the loop were the graduate students. On the inner side were the green with the more senior people, the postdocs and junior faculty type people, and visiting professors, visiting fellows. So it was sort of a university community, and all our kids all played together in the central area, and that's where we were, and we sort of carpooled into the university to let our wife have the car, one car family sort of thing. And I got going on this thing, and I started to work on the pathogenesis and did a lot of adoptive transfer experiments and showed that actually the disease process was indeed T-cell mediated on cell transfer experiments, and quantitated the inflammation with this technique that I developed, and we got a very accurate
So this was actually
measurement.
the counting of lymphocytes?
Counting of cells that had come into the cerebrospinal fluid, or just counting them under a hemocytometer.
So it wasn't differentially counted, or?
It was pretty much a mononuclear cell.
Okay.
It's pretty much mononuclear cell, and some macrophages and some T cells, and we did some macrophage things by feeding the macrophages carbon or whatever to show that they were macrophages.
And did you differentiate? Did you have to differentiate between T's and B's then?
I wasn't that interested in doing that. What I wanted to do was actually get the magnitude of the response. So, you know, a lot of the response is consequential on the initial T-cell invasion. So, in fact, a lot of the response is moderately non-specific. At least we thought so at that stage. So I worked this thing through. I did Evans blue studies, which showed breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, and I worked out that the mice were actually dying of acute brain swelling. Did labeling studies, and I was well along in this process and sort of getting along quite well with it. And then Rolf Zinkernagel came to work in Canberra. Rolf was a young Swiss MD who'd initially started in surgery, but as he says, his supervisor and he had agreed that surgery was not his forte. So I don't know what he did, but he gave up surgery and did some immunology training, that a course that was being run for young Swiss MDs who wanted to go into science in Zurich. He was from Basel. He'd gone to medical school in Basel, had the typical European medical experience of working at the Charité or in Paris and various places. And then he went to Zurich to learn immunology from John Lindemann, who was one of the discoverers of interferon, and Hans-Rudi Ramseyer, who was at that stage interested in idiotype and idiotype interactions, which when he talked about it really drove me nuts. I thought it was crazy stuff. And then from there he went to Lausanne, where he was working with Henry Eastlecker, who was a bacterial pathogenesis person, and was working with, he was influenced by Jean-Charles Serratini and Teddy Brunner, who were then doing beautiful work on cytotoxic T-cell responses. What they were doing is immunizing mice so that across a histocompatibility barrier, then looking at the killer T-cells in a cell culture system where you put the immune lymphocytes onto a 51 chromium target cell in a tissue culture well, or they were actually doing it in a tube, and showed that these cells killed these cells. The T cells killed the target cells, and Rolf tried to set that up with a bacterial system. He tried infecting the cells with salmonella and tried to kill them, and never got it to work. It just didn't work, and it never has worked, I think. He wanted then to get some further training, and he wrote to many places, he tells me, and was totally ignored by them. But he met Gordon Ader, the professor, and Gordon was quite impressed with him. He thought he had promise, and he said that he would take him in Canberra to work with Blandon, who'd done the T-cell work with mousepox, if he could get money. And he got money from the Swiss Education Foundation, and came to Canberra to work with Blandon. And when he got there, which I guess was in early 73, I think, he went into Blandon's lab initially, but the labs were very small, and Rolf sings grand opera, and it's sort of messy, and because Mims had left, I was in a lab by myself with a technician. They put him in with me, and we started to talk, and we had somewhat the same sense of humour. There's a certain shared sense of humour between the Australian and the Swiss. I mean, the Swiss are sort of quite idiosyncratic and individualistic, as you know, and he was Swiss-German. And so we talked a lot, and we got along well, and then I suggested we should do an experiment. I was getting these cells out of the cerebrospinal fluid, and we got together and we decided to look to see whether there was cytotoxic T-cell activity. And we did that. He infected some cells with the virus and labeled them with the chromium, and we put the T-cells together with them, and we showed fantastic killing. I mean, it was an incredible response, much more powerful than the people who were working with alloantigens and seen. So that was our first paper. We published a little paper in Journal of Experimental Medicine. And about that time, I was also asked to write for Transplantation Reviews, which was then the best immunological review journal. And so I was starting to write that. And then in October 1973, we did an experiment where we decided to see whether these cytotoxic T cells were also present in different mouse strains. And we did that experiment because there was a report in the literature that said that there was a histocompatibility-linked immune response gene effect in this system. And it came from Mike Oldstone, who worked for years with LCM virus, Hugh McDevitt, who was the great immunogeneticist who didn't win the Nobel Prize but could have, and Graham Mitchell, who was a young Australian who'd worked with Jacques Miller in Melbourne, who was the guy who discovered the role of the thymus.
Right.
And actually, who was also John Sprent, the younger's PhD supervisor. So Jacques trained some terrific people. And so we looked at this thing and we said, we'll try different mouse strains. We begged and borrowed all the mouse strains we could, and we found that the T cells would only kill the virus-infected cells which were from the same mouse strain or the same histocompatibility type as the target cell. And the fact that we'd used a histocompatibility T cell on a target in the initial experiments was simply fortuitous. It just happened that we were using CBA mice, which are H2K, and that the central tissue culture facility at Canberra, which produced the tissue culture lines for the virologists, was growing L cells, which are also H2K and a mouse cell. And so we got the strong killing. And then we found with the different mouse strains that they had to be histocompatible or they didn't kill. And we took it from there and we worked out the rules for this killing event. We worked out that the T cells were targeted onto the different histocompatibility molecules by using recombinant mice, which have been developed by the transplant people to map that effect. Those mice were got in by Bob Blandon, who was more senior and had more contacts, and he got them in from Chella David and Don Schreffler, who were then at Washington University of St. Louis, I guess. And we mapped it into those regions, and then we did experiments that showed that the T cells that were seeing one transplantation molecule plus virus were different from the T cells that were seeing another transplantation molecule plus virus. And we came up with this idea that because it was a virus-infected cell, we came up with the idea that the T cells were actually recognizing a virally modified transplantation molecule. We called it altered self. And we got the idea that they were using a single receptor. Nobody knew what the T cell receptor was to see altered self. And we argued that, in fact, the whole transplantation system was really this. It was a system for self-monitoring, immune surveillance, if you like, that the T cells were programmed to look at modifications of our own transplantation molecules.
And what actually sort of cued you or made you or gave that sort of direction
there was
to
some cue in that Baruch Ben-Asaraf and David Katz and Alan Rosenthal and Ethan Shivak, prominent US immunologists, were studying a somewhat similar thing, which we now know is associated with what we call the class 2 region, the I region. They had a much less direct assay system, or at least Ben-Asaraf and Katz did, who were publishing most of this material. It was a complicated mouse system that depended on T cell help for antibody production. And they'd come to the conclusion that there was some sort of mutual interaction or self-recognition system. They thought there was a receptor for the histocompatibility molecule. In fact, initially they thought the histocompatibility molecule was the T cell receptor, but that proved out to be wrong. You've got to realize this is all pre-molecular, pre-antibody, pre-molecular antibody, pre-sequence. So we didn't know much about these molecules at all. So that wasn't a bad guess on their part. And they thought there was one receptor for the histocompatibility molecule and one for the antigen, the foreign component. We argued that as a possibility, but we also developed this alternative model, because when you're working with viruses, you naturally think, well, the virus may change the cell. And so it wasn't an outlandish thought to think, well, the virus could be changing the transplantation molecule. And initially we thought of it as more as it might be some sort of allosteric effect, something like that. So that was hard to account for the specificity in an allosteric effect. So we argued this single T cell receptor altered self model. And if you argued that, you could say, well, all the alloantigen is the transplantation antigen, and nobody knew why we had transplantation antigens. The people had speculated about it, and they'd argued why we had a transplantation system, but nobody knew why. And we argued that the transplantation system was just an epiphenomenon of the fact that we had to see our own modified transplantation molecules. So it was really wrongly named, in a sense. It was named for historical reasons. Transplantation should have been called a self-surveillance molecule or a self-marking molecule or something like that. And so we wrote that stuff up. We published 2 papers in Nature, early, I think about April, June 1974. The paper was sent to John Humphrey, who was the prominent British immunologist. Gordon Ada sent the paper to John and said, would you see if you can see this into Nature for us, because we think it's a really important finding. And it came out in Nature, and then we had a subsequent paper which showed there were different T cells recognizing the different transplantation molecules plus, as we now know, peptide. We didn't know that at the time. And that also came out in Nature. So we had 2 Nature letters fairly quickly. And so the material for which the Nobel Prize was awarded was really based on 2 Nature letters, each one side of the page, a total of 2 double-sided pages of Nature, published in 1974, and a subsequent article I wrote as a hypothesis for The Lancet, which really laid out the theoretical basis of what we'd done fairly quickly. So it fairly clearly. And actually we got everything right except the fact that it was a peptide that was being recognized. And of course we knew nothing about the T-cell receptor. So that was a big breakthrough. And we publicized it also.
How did you do that?
Well, because we were in Australia, we kept it very quiet.
Yeah.
Nobody knew about it until the actual paper appeared.
This is the Nature paper.
Well, the Nature papers, also I wrote it in the last part of that transplantation review article, which is actually the first account of it I wrote. It actually appears in that as well. I've just been reminded of that because I've been doing a thing, I think it's for the 30th anniversary of transplantation reviews, which became immunological reviews. And they asked us to do something on turning points in immunology, and so I was writing about this material. We published it there, but nobody knew about it before that because we were in Australia, no email, there's no chattering classes operating, and so we had it to ourselves, and we had a good run. We had from October till the following sort of April or so to really do experiments, and we were able to do experiments very fast. And so that was published, and then it was the time of the second International Immunology meeting, which was held in Brighton. The first one had been in Washington some years before. I wasn't even in immunology then. And so we both traveled. I came to the United States. I went to...
this is, the year now is?
1974.
Right.
So it's mid-1974. And I think I spoke, I gave seminars in something like 20 different institutions in 20 days. I even went, when I was in New York, I even gave 2 seminars in 2 different places on the same day. I think I gave a seminar at NYU and at the Mount Sinai Medical School on the same day. And I just did everything possible to publicize it. I went to Harvard and I saw Katz and Manasarov, saw Shivak and Rosenthal at NIH. And many people have told me subsequently, they heard those seminars, they realized it was important, but they didn't get it because what we were saying, we were turning immunology on its head. We were saying that the transplantation system, which everybody thinks is the ultimate marker of foreignness, is actually the marker of self.
Right.
And it took a while for that to sink through. There was also a lot of hostility. I believe David Katz was very angry about our idea that it was an altered self molecule because it contradicted his theory. And I heard this later. And a lot of people were hostile to that idea, and really most people believed it was wrong until the actual molecular evidence came along 10 years later.
So what actually happened at the presentations? Did you, was it, because this is the US and people are very polite here, so there's not normally the...
No, there was discussion and it was...
attacks that one gets in British shows.
Yeah, there was discussion and people were interested, and I obviously realized, a lot of people realized I think that it was significant, but a lot of people just didn't get it. And
so you didn't run into a...
No, we didn't run into sort of firestorm of criticism or anything like that. And though I believe Katz was very upset, he didn't say anything hostile or anything at the time. It's just I didn't see him after the seminar. I had expected to see him again. I never didn't see him again. And then I went to Europe. I went to Stockholm, which was a good move, and spoke at Göran and Erda Möhler's outfit at the Wallenberg Laboratory at the Karolinska. And Göran was the editor of Transplantation Reviews, the guy that started it off. I went to Hamburg, Fritz Lehmann-Gruber, who was an LCM guy, and spoke there. I think I spoke in Copenhagen. Morgan Zvolkert was at that stage, and Ollie Marker were prominent LCM people, so I spoke there. I went to Britain, and I spoke in London at University College, Ab Mitchison, and spoke at Porton Down, and loads of places, went back to Edinburgh. I mean, you know, it was an incredible tour. I was totally exhausted by the time the Brighton meeting started. I'd given about 30 seminars.
And you spoke at the Brighton meeting?
No, we didn't speak at the Brighton meeting. We weren't on the program. There was no facility at that stage for sort of breaking news, and so we didn't talk on that. Rolf jumped around a lot at the Brighton meeting. He also visited some places in Europe, but didn't do as nearly as extensive a trip as I did. And that sort of really put it on the map. And so suddenly, from being totally unknown, we were pretty well known, actually, because this stuff caught on. And though a lot of people disagreed with our interpretation, the actual phenomenon was clearly correct, because that was replicated quickly. And not only that, in the following year, Liz Simpson in England and Mike Bevan working in the Salk Institute in La Jolla. I also went to the Salk and the Scripps and all those places. Actually found that the same thing happens for minor histocompatibility molecules. So that again took it further along the road. So we found ourselves very well known very quickly. And then 1975, I wrote another review for Immunological Reviews that summed the whole thing up, and it became one of those citation classics. And by that time, Rolf was on his way to, or had gone actually, to the Scripps Institute in La Jolla, and I went to the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia. The place in Canberra, though we'd done something obviously was pretty spectacular, there were just no long-term jobs. All thought of going to the CSIRO was gone, and here we'd made a major discovery, and clearly we couldn't lay this down. And so I was off to Philadelphia. So those years in Canberra were incredibly intense. We worked extraordinarily hard. We did nothing but work. We'd always taken photographs, for instance. There were almost no photographs in our family album from that period. They were very stressful for Penny, and she had two small kids. She was teaching school at the local grammar school. We built a house. We bought a land, and when I went to Philadelphia, it was with the understanding I'd go for a couple of years and then come back to a longer-term position in Canberra, and which could have happened, but in the end didn't for some time. We just worked and worked, and it was Rolf and Catherine Zinkernagel actually had a third child in Melbourne, Martin, who sort of has been backwards and forwards to Australia in the interim, and so it was quite something.
So how did it sort of taper down? You know, you've indicated that you've given all these talks. You're now well known. And there's no real job. Is that the story? That's
basically it. Not in basic science in Australia. Of course, the Australian scientific scene is pretty small. I could have stayed around on a sort of non-tenured, not at a dependent basis, because they were independent positions, but a very uncertain sort of basis. And I was too impatient for that.
Well, you had a wife and two kids, and how old were you?
I had a wife and two kids.
How old were you then?
I was we made the discovery, I was 32.
Right.
33, just turned 33. 34 I was 34 years old at the time I was publicising all this stuff. By 35, I was 34. I moved to Philadelphia. I went to the Wistar Institute when I was travelling through because Mims knew Koprovsky. He'd actually spent time there. Hilary Koprovsky, the director, and Hilary offered me a job. And he did it in a typical Hilary Koprovsky way. He called me up on my birthday and offered me the job. You know, he picked his time and he telephoned me and offered me this job, and I went from being essentially a sort of non-tenured junior assistant professor to being an associate professor at the Wistar Institute.
Yeah, that's quite something. And did you? And so you picked the wife and kids up and dragged them 10,000 miles.
Yes. Well, Gordon Ada said, well, it's a good idea to spend some time in the United States, and I, to some extent, it had been a bit much for them, really, because here was two young guys came in working in a lab by themselves.
Oh, yes, I see.
Had suddenly blown the top off the whole place. I mean, we suddenly made a spectacular discovery, which actually the biggest discovery that was ever made in that place, really. They'd had a Nobel Prize. They had the Nobel Prize for John Eccles. Jack Eccles was a physiologist and won the Nobel Prize in 1963. But his career is more a progression of things, and it wasn't as though there was sort of this single major finding, and it was it's one of the very major finding in Australian science, and so it was difficult for some of the more senior people there, and we'd also been tremendously driving and not necessarily that considerate of people's feelings, being young guys and really and pretty smart. Then I've got a lot dumber as I've got older, but we were pretty smart at that stage, and we were pretty much on the ball, and so the
time had come to move.
Yeah, I think so.
So you went to a place where you were appreciated, where they wanted you, where the economic situation was a bit better.
Yes, and I got into the NIH grant system and so forth when I went to Philadelphia.
Okay.
The Wistar was actually a very good place to do science. It was quite an unusual place. It was very European. Hilary Koprovsky, the director, had really taken the Wistar Institute from a defunct institution and was building it up into a very strong research institute, had over a number of years. He was a good director. He didn't interfere with people. He managed his own research team, but he left everybody else to their own devices. There was no tenure. There was, everyone lived off grants. But Hilary had organised it so he had a very high overhead rate. And so he could fund things like central dishwashing, central animal care, and so on. So it had very good central services. And so you wanted something, you would get it from central services. You ran your own lab, you got your own money, and they, of course, saw me through the initial period.
So how did you find that, to suddenly be thrust into the American grant system and so on?
It was pretty tough to start with, but I think it was very good discipline, and I actually came to appreciate NIH and later went on study section. I came for 2 years and I stayed for over 7.
Did you have to learn the procedure for American grantsmanship and so on?
And I didn't really learn how to write a good grant, actually, until I came to the St. Jude many years later. My grants weren't all that great, actually. They were not that well argued and not that clear, but they got funded. And so I had, I think, 3 grants within a few years, and a couple of R01 grants and a program project grant, and the lab was running pretty successfully. I had a couple of spectacular graduate students, Jack Bennick and Rita Efros, who've both gone on to do very good stuff. A couple of MD, PhD students, Neil Greenspan and David Schwartz, who've done reasonably well. And so it was an exciting time. And University of Pennsylvania at that time, we were in the Wistar Institute, was an independent institute. So I was paid and employed by the Wistar Institute. But the University of Pennsylvania had their graduate work organised into graduate groups, and I was part of the immunology graduate group. This was, it had a separate chairman, and it was a horizontal organisation across all the departments. And it also came through the Wistar and through the veterinary school and the medical school and the Fox Chase Cancer Centre, the dental school. So it was, the students were affiliated to the graduate group, but they would end up eventually in someone's lab in one or other department or program or institution. And so some of them came across to the Wistar. And a lot of those students were funded on a training grant that was organised by Darcy Wilson and Norman Kleinman.
This is one of the NIH ones.
And I think basically at that stage, I think the University of Pennsylvania was the best university immunology program in the country, quite frankly. Now, other people will probably dispute that, but I think it was really very good. And it was an interesting place because Darcy loved ideas and he would love to argue with people, and Norman was a very good leader as well, and so it was a good place to be.
And how about the climate in the city?
Philadelphia, it took me a while to get used to Philadelphia. I mean,
did you live in downtown or did you have to live way out?
No, we lived for a little while in New Jersey, across, you could get this Lindenwold high-speed lane across, but New Jersey was awful. I mean, it was straight, flat suburbia. I'd loathed it, actually. And then we moved on to the main line of Philadelphia, which is very nice. I mean, we lived initially in an apartment complex and then bought a little house out in Rosemont, which is right close to Villanova University. Penny went back to school and did library science qualification at Villanova, and then got into drug information at the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy. Our 2 kids were initially in the public school system, and then we sent them to the Haverford School, which was a fantastic boys' school just down the road from us. And so, it was pretty good, and we were doing pretty well there, and I was quite happy with the situation. I was pretty much on the international scene, running a pretty active lab in cellular immunology. I was being offered some fairly spectacular jobs, which I didn't take because it always seemed the Wistar always seemed a better place to do science.
In North America or elsewhere?
Well, I was tried to recruit me to NIH, which would have been quite a good move. Tried to recruit, one job I looked at right at the end before I left was possibility of a Howard Hughes operation in Vanderbilt, which would have been really good, actually, and very well funded, and Vanderbilt's not a bad institution. And now Vanderbilt, of course, has improved enormously as a university. So there were a number of opportunities out there, and I was traveling fairly extensively, and we were pretty satisfied with what we were doing. But there was always the call back to Australia and so forth. And,
so after how many years? It was a 7-year stint there?
Yes. We were there 7 years, and Then I was approached again by the CSIRO,
Mm-hmm.
who were trying to recruit someone to head the Division of Animal Health,
Mm-hmm.
which was the division that Eric French had worked in.
Mm-hmm.
Was Alec Lascelles, who was the director, was stepping down, and they brought me out ostensibly as a consultant.
Okay.
And I went around and visited these various places. But at the same time, I learned that the chair of experimental pathology, Department of Experimental Pathology in Canberra, the National University, was vacant. And so I thought possibly I could go back there and sort of try and re-establish that era that Gordon Ader had fostered in the microbiology department.
Mm-hmm.
So I did go back there, but it unfortunately didn't work very well. So, yeah.
So just before we move back to Australia, just tell us about the wife and kids and the family and everything else about suddenly packing up all your worldly goods and shipping them again 10,000 miles. Was there?
Yeah.
Your wife obviously is very flexible.
Well, she wanted to go back to Australia, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of thought that I should go back to Australia. At that stage, the Australian dollar was worth a bit more than the US dollar.
1.25.
Well, it was about 1.05.
Was it?
Now, of course, the Australian dollar is worth about 53 cents US,
Yes.
which is a more realistic level for it. It was basically at an inflated level. The boys were pretty happy in Philadelphia. They were happy at their school. They would have been quite happy to stay there. And if they had, of course, I guess they would have gone on possibly to Penn, possibly somewhere else. And we would have been pretty embedded in that culture. Though I suspect I would have moved on from the Western Institute and taken a job somewhere else, and probably in a university setting somewhere. I turned down jobs at the Scripps. Zinkernagel left to go back to Britain, and they tried to recruit me to go to the Scripps. I guess it may have been ridiculous, but I didn't want my kids to grow up in Southern California. There were various choices to make. I was offered a job in Rochester, which was very good, and then it didn't really turn out very well for the person who did subsequently take the job. So it was a good one. Good thing I didn't take that.
So you went back to Australia, and of course the old story about a prophet is not without honour except in his own country. Unfortunately, has been true for.
Well, that period didn't work too well. What had happened was that the John Curtin School, the National University, where I'd done the work with Zinkernagel, it really, in a sense, it was already in decline when we were doing that work. And the reason it was in decline was this was an institution that had been set up in the 1960s due to the Australia realised it didn't have any postgraduate medical education. It was brought to this realisation by Howard Florey, the Australian scientist who went to Oxford in the 1920s, established, or in Britain in the 1920s, established himself there and was the professor of pathology at Oxford, the Dunn School. Florey and Chain and Fleming won the Nobel Prize for penicillin in 1945. Florey and Chain, Fleming discovered penicillin many years before and then sort of forgot about it. Florey and Chain developed penicillin as a therapeutic.
Yeah.
And Florey who was a great organizer and a good experimentalist, a man who didn't speculate at all. He was a very, I read up on him because I had to speak at his centenary of his birth and in some affairs in Australia, but obviously didn't like to speculate. He was a very, very conservative type of scientist, but he was very interested in antibacterials. He worked on lysozyme, which had also been worked on by Fleming early on. Reason he couldn't develop that into a therapeutic agent, but then took up penicillin. And Chain, who was a chemist, a refugee Jewish chemist from Europe, did the chemistry, and they worked together and got reasonable amounts of penicillin. And then Florey came across the United States and actually got the Americans to gear it up.
Actually, he brought the cultures with him.
He did, yeah. And
his
of course,
precious little culture.
that caused a lot of angst because, you know, the Brits felt they didn't get the credit and the money from it that they should have, and of course they went to the... But of course, by the time of D-Day, there was plenty of penicillin available, and a lot of lives were saved on both sides.
In fact, there's one story that within weeks of those cultures coming across, the massive American investigative machinery had found other strains of penicillin, obviously floating around, which were even more effective in producing...
I think that's right. It was
penicillium, I should say, more effective in producing penicillin. Then, of course...
Well, it was a whole quantum change in drugs and so forth. And so Florey then became quite a prominent figure. I mean, he was the saviour of mankind because of penicillin and all the rest of it. And it was like Salk years later with the Salk vaccine. Only Florey did win the Nobel Prize and poor old Jonas didn't. He then was backwards and forwards to Australia because, and he got to talk to a very senior politician, I think. I don't think it was the Prime Minister, but eventually he was in contact with Curtin, who was then the Prime Minister, and they decided to set up this, or Chifley rather. Curtin had died at the end of the Second World War, a bit like Roosevelt, I guess. And, Chifley was the Labor Prime Minister. And the idea came through of setting up this postgraduate university, based a bit on the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton. And so they had this idea of independent research schools which would pursue various activities. It was physical sciences was one of the original ones. There was physical sciences, social sciences, and Asian studies, and the medical school, John Curtin School of Medical Research. And so that was sort of started to get put together in the late 1950s, I guess. No, in the 1950s. And the foundation professors were appointed, Frank Fenner to microbiology, Jack Eccles to physiology, and so forth. And they were very well funded, very well resourced, and Fenner built what was one of the best virology programs in the world. Same with Eccles, who built the fantastic physiology program, and there were other very good departments as well. So in the 60s, it was a very powerful research institute. But where they went wrong is they didn't heed Florey's advice. And Florey had said, give people tenure, but for 5 years. Give them 5-year contracts and then renew them depending on their performance. And instead they went down the line that the Australian universities followed at that stage, and they gave them lifetime contracts. And that was a disaster. So by the 1970s, the Institute, when I came there first, about half the people who were there as scientists, and this includes the postdocs and everything, about half of them were tenured scientists. And some of them were still doing pretty good work, and you know, some people always do pretty good work. But some of them had sort of slacked off because there was no review process. They had to write no grants. The money just came through the director. That was fine as long as the money was flush. But as these guys slowed down, and many of the most ambitious and more driven ones moved out because you could only have quite a small lab in that structure, you got left with a lot of people who really weren't that spectacular. I mean, there were some very good people who stayed, but some of them weren't that great. And by the 80s, by the time I came back to Canberra, then basically there was a real problem. There wasn't enough money, and many of the tenured contracts were filled up with people who just weren't doing exciting contemporary science. And there was no way of getting rid of them. And so I sat with this for a couple of years and then tried to diminish the resources that were available to some of these people and got into real trouble. I suggested that what really needed to happen was the Institute needed to take some of its money and throw it into the competitive grant system. We had a very good competitive grant system in Australia, modelled on NIH, set up by Burnett. It's called the National Health and Medical Research Council. So I suggested if they threw some of their money into that, then they could compete for the grants, and we get rid of these tenured contracts and put people on 5-year contracts, subject to performance. And that was as though the Antichrist had sort of suddenly risen in the middle of Canberra. I mean, these people, they were so threatened. Well, what they asked us, what the Vice-Chancellor at that stage, who was a man called Carmel, asked us to do, was to do a review of the Institute of Advanced Studies, which are these research institutes. By that time, the university had changed from being a purely research university to being a university with two components. There was the faculties, which was an undergraduate university, which had developed out of a college from Melbourne University, a sort of seed college sort of thing, and the Institute of Advanced Studies. They brought this together and they had these two boards. There was the board of the Institute of Advanced Studies, BIAS, and there was the board of the faculty. And it was run by a single vice-chancellor, and the research schools were all headed by directors. And so Carmel realised they were getting very short of money, so he asked for a small group to review the Institute of Advanced Studies and make a report to him. And so 3 of us did it. I mean, there was me, there was a guy called Don Aitken, who was a political scientist, and a guy called Jacob Israelik-Veli, who was a mathematician. FRS, very fine mathematician, Israeli, who'd come to Australia. And so we looked at the Institute of Advanced Studies, and we came to more or less the conclusions that I've just told you, that they should get rid of tenure, and that they should start to get people to start writing competitively for research funds. I mean, this was a totally most unwelcome to the Vice-Chancellor, who
Oh, it
didn't-
was?
Oh, he hated it. I mean, he was a Labor Party man who really wanted a steady state universe with lots of people who were sort of drones, I think, and had no real appreciation of excellence. And then it was deeply threatening to many of the staff who suddenly being told, you know, you're not God's gift to science. I mean, you're actually not doing very well at all. I mean, you really need to get out there and justify your existence. And that was considered, we were accused of academic Thatcherism. The name of the committee was Aitken, Israelic Valley and Doherty, the AIDS committee. Backs to the wall, the AIDS committee is about the sort of thing. We went round, we presented this case to the various research institutes, some tremendous hostility.
Manifested how?
Oh, just virulent attacks, both personal attacks after the lectures and then other attacks that went on behind our back, and there was a lot of machination, people talking to the politicians and so forth. And it became extremely unpleasant, very unpleasant for my wife. I was head of a department, and it was just a very unpleasant experience. And I reasoned, you know, I'm wasting my time here, and you know, there's no way I'm going to win this battle. Obviously, I'd gone around about, well, we had gone about trying to improve this place in a way that was both naive and impractical. And so we got it wrong, which was interesting because Aitken was a political scientist and he got it wrong. And he had hoped, I think, to succeed Carmel as Vice-Chancellor. Carmel was due to retire fairly soon, and his chances were killed stone cold dead by this. Israelic Valley told him to get lost and left shortly afterwards for University of California at Santa Barbara. And I started to look around. I mean, there was no way I was going to stay in this institution. 15 years later, they did exactly what we said. And the university has started to pick up again. John Curtin School came under a new director, had another director in the interim, Kevin Lafferty, who was one of the guys who was there when I was doing the work with Zinkernagel. A very bright guy who came back from National Jewish Hospital, not National Jewish, the Barbara Davis Childhood Diabetes Center in Denver to head the John Curtin School. Tried to turn it around and was vilified again and substantially attacked. I came under a virulent personal attack again. But then they got a new director in, the financial realities had changed, and the new director, Judy Whitworth, was former chief medical officer for the Australian government and is a very sophisticated and a good political player with good political connections. And she's basically turned it around, and they're doing just that. There's no tenured contracts, everybody's on 5-year renewal appointments.
What actually happened? Did they cease the others or do they let them run out?
Well, if they don't, they now have to compete for funding. There are still some of them there. They now have to compete for funding. And if they don't get the funding, the area of research can essentially be declared redundant. So they don't fire them, but you know, if their area of research is redundant, there's no reason to keep employing them.
That's right,
And so, you know, this had to happen. And actually, it's no longer a problem, and the people that are there are all pretty good, actually, and there's some bright young people coming on, and the whole institution, the feel of it is so much better, and it's just getting better very, very rapidly. So 15 years later, they did what we suggested, and but I left Australia. I mean,
So how did you make the jump from there and pick St. Jude's in Memphis, Tennessee,
well,
I might mention?
I knew I needed to get out
We
of...
both are, I should say, for the record.
I needed to get out of Canberra.
Right.
And that was a very difficult decision to come to because our kids were well established. And
How old were they now, in high school?
There was also another disastrous situation, which was a personal situation, which had to do with the suicide of one of Penny's colleagues, who was paranoid, schizophrenic, and actually blamed Penny for this. And this was a horrific situation and very badly handled. I mean, she was working in the public service. The people that handled it were incompetent. They didn't, typical Australian males, they didn't discuss anything with anybody. They didn't open it out. They didn't try and get people help. And it was a disaster. And so that was another factor in our leaving. And also by that time, I thought I had the support of the director, Bob Porter, for a process of reform, and his support really wasn't there. And so I became pretty disillusioned with him in one way or another. So we'd sort of fallen out as well. So it was all, the whole thing had fallen apart.
Right.
And so I really did not want to stay there under any circumstance. And I started to look around. And at that stage, I was on the board of the ILRAD lab in Nairobi. In 1986, I'd gone on the board of the ILRAD lab, which is in Nairobi, which required me to go to Nairobi twice a year. And they were giving me a first-class return air ticket. which I would then convert into a round-the-world ticket. And I was using that. I went through the States and I looked at various places and talked to various people and started to explore where I might move to. And I'd given up my green card to go back to Australia. I'd given up all my research grants, of course. There's no way I could sustain my NIH grants in Australia. And I had two kids who one was in university already and another one coming to university education age. And I needed some money, so I needed to get a job which was reasonably secure to see them through their education, which had some resources that they could offer. So I looked at a number of places. I wasn't interested in being in a university at that stage. I was so turned off universities because of the Canberra experience. Part of the problem is, university is a very complex organism, and you say to people, this guy is, he's terrible. He publishes one paper a year, if that, and it's a mediocre paper, and they say, well, I'm a historian and I haven't published a book for 7 years and, I'm pretty good. And so why are you criticizing him? So, the clash of cultures, if you like, and so forth. And also in Canberra, with the John Curtin School, we had benchmarks. We had the National Health and Medical Research Council system. We had some very strong research institutes, the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. And this institution was performing so badly relative to those institutions that there really was something very seriously wrong. But the people inside couldn't see that. And many of them who are still there from that era still can't see it. They were even performing badly compared with the ILRAD lab in Nairobi, which is really a pretty serious condemnation for something that's supposed to be a national university. There were good people there. I formulated the rule of thirds, that if you have a system where you have no real review process, a third of the people will do very well because they always do very well no matter where they are. A third of the people would do better if there was some sort of sense that there's some sort of sword hanging over their head. And a third of the people would just don't have it anyway. I mean, a lot of people get appointed to university appointments and they really don't make it. And through the American system, you weed those people out through their assistant professorship. You don't confirm them to an associate professorship with tenure. And so they didn't do that. They appointed them to permanent appointments straight off. And it's disastrous to do that. So it's a culture that's gone. I mean, it's completely gone from the Australian scene. It doesn't exist anymore.
The Australian system's rather cruel at the present moment, isn't it?
It became a little too cruel, I think, and the money's been pretty short, and it's been pretty harsh and pretty cruel. Science, in a way, is a harsh, cruel thing to do for a living. I mean, this is a harsh mistress. You're either doing, I mean, it's much better for a lot of people not to be in a research institute, the sort of culture I've lived in, but to be in a university teaching institution where they have teaching to do, they have obligations, they have administrative things, all those things that need to be done to make a university operate can make people feel good about themselves and they don't have to be doing stellar research. If you're in a research institute like St Jude or the John Curtin School, you have to be doing first-class research or you should not be there. If you're in that institution and you're doing poorly, you'll dream up all sorts of reasons why everybody around you is not doing the right research or they're emphasizing the wrong thing, and you will become a negative factor. Or you really have to get out. And I think the problem is, it's like developing Alzheimer's disease. You don't know things are going wrong.
Until they do.
People cannot, very few people can actually look really objectively at themselves and say, hey, I'm not doing this. And I shouldn't be here. Some can, some can't. The NIH grant helps you a lot with that. It tells you, you're not getting funded, you should be doing something else. And we find that at St Jude, actually. People who are not doing well will look for more of a teaching position.
You did not have NIH grants while you were in Australia?
I had one. I was able to take one back with me. It had just been funded. I had it for 3 years. But the level of resources and such in Australia and so forth was such that I really didn't think I could renew it from Australia. And I didn't try. So when it came to coming back to the States, I had to look around for a place which would support me reasonably well for a time. People wanted me to go to the Scripps, to National Jewish in Denver. They were two places that are great places, good immunology. But St Jude just offered me a tremendous amount. And it also offered me something else. I'd been in this environment in Canberra, which was, I'd become really a persona non grata. I mean, they really did not like me, because I'd attacked their sacred cows and so forth, and they didn't really want me around. And I have a fair amount of charm and a fair amount of persuasiveness, but these people hated my guts. And some of them, of course, still do. And I So St. Jude was different. St. Jude was a pediatric institution with a first-class research institute. It was in Memphis, Tennessee, which is a pretty unlikely place. But being in Memphis, Tennessee, meant that everybody had to get together and interact. And so it was a very caring institution, though it's every kid that's there is on a research protocol. Very caring institution. I just thought the atmosphere was marvelous. And the director at that time, Joe Simone, was just an incredibly good people person. And so, so in the end, I chose St. Jude and the chance to set up a new research department in St. Jude.
Well, was there any sort of expectation from them or any direction from them or any... Did you have a feeling where the research should go or what sort it should be? Or
I mean, Alan Granoff, who was head of the virology department, I think told Simone that this guy could win the Nobel Prize.
Really?
And I think that's part of the motivation for recruiting me. And I knew that I had a shot at the Nobel Prize. I thought it was a bit unlikely because Baruch Ben-Asraf and George Snell and John Dosset had got the Nobel Prize for histocompatibility.
Okay.
Okay. And yet we'd sort of discovered what it was about, but these were the earlier figures, obviously.
Right.
The one who missed out there was Hugh McDevitt. But, you know, you can only give the Nobel Prize to 3 people. So I thought that sort of ruled us out. We won the Ehrlich Prize in 1983, and we won that's the German Science Prize. That was a lot to do with Koprovsky, who was on that committee.
Okay, I'm trying to put this in my mental... You were where in 83?
83, I just moved back to Australia.
Okay.
82, I moved back to Australia from Philadelphia.
Really?
Yeah.
And when did the FRS come in?
The FRS, I got the FRS, I think, 87. I was elected to the Australian Academy of Science in 83, the first year I was nominated.
Right.
I got the Ehrlich Prize in 83. I think we got the Gairdner Prize, which is another prize, which is a prize that's a predictor prize for the Nobel Prize, because they go through a very thorough review process.
Right.
Canadian Science Prize.
Right.
We got that in, I think, 86, and I think I was elected to the Royal Society in 87. Again, I was elected into the Royal Society the first year I was nominated, which is pretty unusual.
So just refresh me again. You came back here to St. Jude's in
88.
88. So in other words, you had quite an array of
I was winning major international awards.
And the Australians didn't want you.
Canberra. I mean, it was a function of Canberra and the National University as it then was.
Right.
And it's a different institution now in many ways. But
but
in 83, I was very accustomed to the American way of doing things. Research grants that have, you know, you used what you could to publicize your institution. When I won the Ehrlich Prize, I went along and saw the people at the local university newspaper and so forth and said, look, you know, I won this prize, can we use it to... So they did that. And then I started winning other things, and I got the impression that they were getting increasingly hostile because here's this guy who's promoting himself.
Yes.
I wasn't trying to promote myself, I was trying to promote the institution.
Right.
And it was just that different mindset.
Yes, yes.
Sort of a mean-spirited mindset, actually, which was rather, I think, Australia has changed enormously. It's changed because of economic reality, and people have realised that it has to be much more competitive, and people have started to think much more openly in that. But it was very much a society that was dominated by the old Labor Party sort of make them stand in a line and fill out a form and sit down and shut up and don't step out of line sort of society.
Well, you haven't mentioned it in this interview, but you have in others when you've talked about that life in Australia in the 50s was...
Oh, dull.
Well, you said boring, boring,
Oh,
boring.
well, Brisbane particularly. I mean, it was boring.
But the whole point about it was a society where everybody had a slot.
Yeah, a place for everyone. I mean, the British colonial model, a place for everyone and everyone in their place.
That's right.
Yes.
And so...
But that's the sort of society that doesn't exist anymore in the West.
No, and it must be very threatening to them.
It's very threatening to many people, which is a lot of the reason why many people are very unhappy and seek other sorts of solutions to things. But, you know, it's gone in Australia. The idea of lifetime jobs in Australia is gone, just as it is here. It's a much more open, very flexible. And as you say, Australia is actually a fairly harsh society now. It's pretty tough.
Well, the universities are, aren't they?
Well, in general, I think it's pretty tough. I mean, there are elements of that are still governed by trade unions and so forth, where there's some feather bedding, but a lot of it's gone. A lot of it's gone. And the country just can't afford it. And everybody knows it and goes along with it. So it's a very different culture.
I guess we've almost come to the end of the second part of this period.
Right.
So why don't we take a break? When we come back, we'll pick up from St. Jude's and the great news you got and how that changed your life and what you've done then.
Fine.
Thank you. Well, Peter, we're back to the final stage now. You're going to come to Memphis, join St. Jude's, and then, of course, the big news comes and your life has changed. So.
Well, that was a few years. I mean, we moved to Memphis. We moved back furniture we'd bought in Philadelphia that had gone across the Pacific to Australia and moved to Memphis. We bought an old house in Central Gardens area of Memphis, a 100-year-old house, and where we lived for 14 years. And Jim, the elder boy, stayed in Australia. He was already in law school and stayed there and married an Australian girl. And our other son, Mike, came across with us, went to Boston University, then Tufts Medical School, and qualified as a neurologist and married a Boston girl. So that's what happened in the family over the years. Penny didn't continue working, but she's volunteered a lot at St Jude Hospital. So I was back in the States, again a fairly prominent scientist, writing grants. So St Jude provided a lot of resources, and they'd given me a lot of resources to set up an immunology department. St Jude at that stage was pretty much a cancer hospital. I said, do you want me to do tumour immunology? And Joe Simone says, no way, that's all crap. And so I didn't do that and went on with viral immunity. Part of the reason I'd gone there is a very strong virology department under, at that stage, Alan Granoff, and particularly Rob Webster, who's a prominent flu virologist who, New Zealander, again had worked with the Australian National University, and was really the person who'd heard that I was pretty unhappy and really organised for me to come to St Jude. I'd been to St Jude before. I'd been there on my tour in 1974, actually, and spoken there when it was a tiny institution. Well, St Jude is just a great place. I mean, it's a great research institute, very caring institution, tremendously committed board of governors who put enormous effort into it. And because we're in Memphis, Tennessee, which is a bit isolated, everybody talks to each other and gets on pretty well. So it's been a great experience working there. Got things going, recruited people, got a department going in a reasonable way. It was doing pretty well. Got some young people who were interested in other areas of immunology there as assistant professors, and they got interested in viral immunity, and so got some more people prominent in viral immunity. And David Woodland, who moved out after the Nobel Prize. I won the Nobel Prize because everyone thought I was leaving. People started to leave, and the department tended to fall apart a bit. He and Marcy Blackman, his wife, moved up to the Trudeau Institute in upstate New York, and Woody is actually continuing more or less a lot of the themes that I was doing, and as I'm moving on to other things, in fact. So it's been very satisfying. So we had a good time there. Neither of the children were with us. We would see them. We'd visit Australia, or they'd come and visit us every year, and things went on. Much like an American family, really. Your kids are not at home after college age, and our kids were off. And then it went well, publishing quite well, and a couple of years pretty slow, the move and all that.
But there were some awards during this period.
Well, the first award was the Lasker Award. We won the Lasker Award in 1995, and that just came out of the blue. I had no idea we were nominated, and no expectation of this thing, and hadn't been thinking about anything like that, in fact. In fact, I did think we were pretty much ruled out for the Nobel Prize because of the Bonastra thing, though I thought in some ways we still might stand a crack at it, because the molecular people in the 1980s had really worked out the mechanism, and it was the mechanism we suggested. And so I thought maybe we've got some sort of crack at this, but they never give a Nobel Prize twice for the same thing. So we won the Lasker in 1995 with Don Wiley, a structural biologist, Jack Strominger, Emil Unanimi. Strominger and Wiley worked together, both from Harvard. Emil from Washington University at St. Louis, who'd worked on antigen processing, and Zinkernagel and I. And so that was a surprise. And then, you know, the Lasker and the Gairdner are the two prizes that are actually considered the bellwether prizes for the Nobel. And people started to talk about us again for the Nobel. I mean, we'd heard just rumours. You never know you're nominated for the Nobel. We'd heard rumours before that we were being nominated, and I'd always discounted them. Then we won the Lasker Award for basic medical research. And basically, half the people who win the Lasker Award for basic medical research go on to win the Nobel Prize. Nobody who's won the Nobel Prize ever wins the Lasker, because that's not the way it works. But these prizes, and the Lasker is a very prestigious prize, it's the North American Medical Research Prize, really, try to pick Nobel winners, because that gives them stature, because the Nobel has just such stature to it. So we went up to those things, and then people were saying, well, you're giving us about 30% odds that we win the Nobel. And I thought, well, you know, it could happen, but I thought it had gone on too long. And I reasoned that we would either win it soon or we would not win it. So we didn't get it in 1995. The Lasker is announced earlier. And then the next year, early October, we get a call at 4 o'clock in the morning saying, this is Niels Ringert's from the Nobel Foundation. My wife picks up the phone and she says, the Nobel Foundation. She says, this is for you, and gives me the telephone.
Calling from?
You're calling from Stockholm. They just had the meeting which had made the final decision on the 1996 Nobel Prize, and we were told we had 10 minutes to get our act together, and then they'd announce it and our world would go crazy, which is absolutely right. It did go crazy. It was tremendously busy after that. The first thing I did, being at St Jude, is I called our public relations guy, Jerry Chipman, and he set up a line for the media and so forth, so we didn't have to handle it because our telephone was ringing just off the hook. And we were on sort of beamed on television that morning. One of my colleagues, Tom Curran, was actually returning from a meeting on a Greek island on a Greek ferry, and he's sort of bleary-eyed after several days of one of those Greek island meetings where people tend to drink a little, and he sort of looks up and there's my face on the television. He thought he was hallucinating. So that sort of changed our life very dramatically, and that Nobel year is like the Miss America year a bit. So I was on the circuit, did a lot of publicity for St Jude. They had me to various dinners and so forth, and I was often doing a double act with Marlo Thomas, who's the daughter of Danny, the actress, who's the daughter of Danny Thomas, the television radio personality who actually, entertainer, who actually set up St Jude in the first place. And so we would go along to things, and Marlo, who's very charming, would do her performance, and you know, it was very beautifully done, and she would get very emotional and so forth. And after I'd heard it 2 or 3 times, I realised she was doing exactly the same thing. She was an actress, so she was doing her performance. And of course, I couldn't remember my lines from 1 minute to the next. So every time I would do something spontaneous and different. So I was enormously impressed with her, and I think she was quite impressed with me. And so we did that. And of course, the Nobel year, everyone wants you to speak, and you're on the circuit and all the rest of it. And you get all sorts of strange requests and contacts. And you get some sense of what it must be like to be a public figure, though you're not really that public a figure. People don't recognise you in the street and all that sort of thing.
So what percentage of the time were you away for the first, say, 6 months?
Well, firstly, the prize is announced in October. You then, 2 things that Nobel Prize winners do that you have to do, well, you don't have to do them, I guess, but I think, well, I suppose you do have to do them. You have to write a personal account. So I wrote a rather frank personal account because I thought it would just go into a book that nobody would ever look at, because I'd never seen one of these things, and most people have never seen the personal accounts that have been written by Nobel Prize winners since 1901, when the first prize was awarded. But of course they put it immediately onto the web, so people quote this personal account back at me all the time because it's on the Nobel website. The other thing is you have to write your Nobel lecture, and so I had to put effort into that. And then deal with all the other things, the other commitments you've made. I had to cancel a lot of commitments, I couldn't handle them. And that went well, and then we were in December for the Nobel Award, which is a spectacular week, and with the other Nobel Prize winners for that year.
Let me just ask you one thing about that, because most of us now have seen this movie.
The Prize?
No, The Brilliant Mind.
Yeah. I haven't seen the movie, but we did. John Nash was actually in Stockholm last December when it was the 100th anniversary of the Nobel Prize. So they brought all the Nobel Prize winners who were still sufficiently mobile back, and so we went back, and John Nash was there, and I didn't speak to him, but because at that time I hadn't read the book. I did subsequently, and I think it's a fine book. And but Penny had, and so she spoke to him and saw him in the elevator, and he was functioning pretty well. And
well, in the movie, of course, he gives this speech, which isn't really a thank you speech to his wife, but then he just turns and walks off the stage. And I was just curious, knowing European protocol, that there would be some more.
No, I'm not sure what the speech was that we're referring to, but he won the economics prize for game theory. There's a Nobel lecture where you're supposed to give a formal lecture. Now, some people give something quite brief. Some people give a very factual account of their life and history and science and so forth. For instance, Paul Nurse and Tim Hunt and Lee Hartwell won it this year, and we heard their Nobel lectures because we were there for the 100th anniversary. And Paul sort of recounted he's quite a personality, he recounted his life, and it started out with Paul, nurse with the long hair, and there's a part of moustache, and a really hippie character, and ends up with Paul, nurse, the Sir Paul, the well-dressed, well-groomed director of the Imperial Cancer Research Fund. And Tim Hunt did something rather similar in sort of that amusing British type way. So people do different things, and I don't know whether it was his Nobel lecture, or it might have been, they then have, there's no acceptance speech at the actual ceremony.
So when the king...
All they do is just simply present the award.
Well, I think the movie may not, when you see it, it may
and then,
not...
But there is a speech, one person from each category, medicine, physics, chemistry, economics, gives a short address at the Nobel banquet, which is held that evening.
This was on a stage.
Yeah, so this probably would have been the Nobel banquet address.
Well, there were a few things...
And they're very brief, and there's no formal thanks or anything. You just give the talk and you walk off the stage.
I see.
That's basically the one that I remember from this last year was Naipaul, who...
oh, gosh, I've read his books. I've read his books. Yeah, so he has such... if you've read the ones about King, you've talked about King.
Yes, I know, yeah. He's, shall we say, pithy. Well, he has very definite negative opinions about the British Empire and the former British colonies.
Well, he had some are unrepeatable here in this tape,
yes.
But other ones where he talked about the British faculty at the Uganda University. He said they're infy. They're infies. Inferiors. He had a series of...
We shouldn't pursue that too far, but
no,
we don't have to take responsibility for Naipaul.
Well, it's just that it was an interesting...
he's an interesting guy.
Yes.
He's a very smart guy, I think, and but certainly a controversialist.
Yeah.
So that was all very fine, but we got back to Memphis after this, and it was a big event and all the rest of it, and we had a very heavy year ahead because the Nobel year, you're getting a lot of invitations and you feel certain obligations. There are certain things that you can sort of say, no, I don't want to do that, but there are certain things that if people ask you, either for reasons of friendship or because of the actual event, you really feel you should try and do.
Right.
And so I was in that situation. And then on Christmas Eve, I got a call from Australia telling me that I'd been made the Australian of the Year, and they expected me out there on Australia Day, which I think is January 26th or something.
It is.
So a month off, I'm expected to be in Australia. And not only that, I'm expected to do a tour of all the Australian capital cities and speak about what I'm doing and stuff. So I thought, well, firstly, I said to the guy, couldn't we put this off a year? I mean, and he said, well, you can if you want, but don't ever come back here. So I had to do it, and I had to cancel out of a lot of things. And so I went back, and we did that. We took 3 trips back that year.
Did you? There was one of them where you went back and you were sort of informed that you should go straight on to Canberra.
It was actually after the Nobel Prize was announced, before the prize was awarded, it was actually my son's wedding in Melbourne.
Okay.
So we were already programmed to go to Melbourne for his wedding. And when the Australians heard that I was coming, the Prime Minister, John Howard, actually turned on an event at Parliament House in Canberra where he invited scientists from all over Australia to come, and he made a formal speech, and the leader of the opposition, or the acting leader to the opposition at that stage, also made a speech. Now, it was the first time that had happened in Australian politics, that actually a Prime Minister had recognised, in a sense, the scientific community in that way. And of course, the Australians were enormously pleased by it. They like to win prizes, and here was a prize that an Australian had won, even though I'm working in the US, and I had no thought that I'd be made Australian of the Year. I mean, it never occurred to me. And but here's something that they can feel good about. And it was very good for Australian science, because the Howard government, which had come in after years of Labor government, were quite an effective and rather a dry Labor government in the economic sense, trying to cut public spending. They'd got the thing right with the exchange rates, so now the exchange rate was much more realistic, and the country wasn't doing that badly economically, though people didn't like the fact that suddenly their dollar's worth 60 cents and so forth. And the Howard government was all set about slashing and cutting and burning a lot further, and they actually had started to cut science funding and so forth. And here I came into the scene, and then I used that Australian of the Year period where I was to tour all the Australian capital cities. I think we made 3 trips back to speak in various cities and talk at various events. I talked to the National Press Club. the Australian Broadcasting Commission, the national broadcaster, arranged for me to be on all sorts of venues, from very serious current affairs programs to talkback radio, and even a television comedy program that had the name Club Buggery, which was a rather irreverent thing run by a couple of highly intelligent guys, actually, called Roy and H.G., who sort of interviewed me, and we had a lot of sort of backwards and forwards and jokes about the fact I'd work with sheep and Nobel Prize winners all go crazy in the end and all that sort of thing. So it was quite fun and sort of high profile in a way. And so I found myself gradually getting in the position. I made a few mistakes early on. I got very involved in the issue of whether Australia should become a republic, which was a side issue to what I should have been talking about, which was really the issue of education and science. And I realized that fairly quickly, and I got on message. And it's, you know, like Bill Clinton, it's the economy stupid. And I got on that, it's education and science stupid. So I sort of stuck to that message as much as I could. And I sort of learned how, I think, again, to speak to people more generally in a way that was communicating with people rather, and you can't talk down to people in any sense. And I guess, you know, the Australian culture gives you that to some extent. We're a fairly egalitarian society in the way that we deal with each other. It's not all that egalitarian in some aspects, actually, but in the way we deal personally with each other, we're pretty egalitarian. So that went over reasonably well, and I sort of became a sort of a part of the media world in the minor sense as a sort of science spokesman and so forth. And I continued to do that. I did another tour the following year for the Australian Society of Medical Research, where I did much the same thing. And then I spent 3 months a year back in Australia, 3 one-month periods a year back in Australia, where I've done a lot of public speaking and various events and talked to various groups and so forth, and try to be a sort of spokesman for science in a way that seems as though it's not for my personal advantage, but it's basically for the advantage of the community. And I take this very seriously, actually, because I think we live in a world where the forces against reason and logic and good sense are very strong, partly through some aspects of the sort of Hollywood-type culture, and partly because we've been living in a world that's changing so enormously rapidly. Many people are very unsure and uncertain and afraid, and some of them are turning back to rather rigid belief systems or to hokey belief systems. And so I've learned how to I think I've learned gradually how to sort of talk to people like that without disparaging what they think, but hopefully to raise questions in their minds. And I think that's the important thing to do, is not to try to impose your values on somebody, but to cause others to look at their own values and try and ask some questions of themselves. And, you know, we all have to do that. I mean, so it's been interesting, I think, being in that position. And I hope to do more of that. In fact, we're gradually moving out of Memphis. In fact, I started a new research lab in Melbourne in July, and I'll be spending 9 months a year in Australia now instead of 9 months in the US, and 3 months back in the US, at least for a time. So it's a transition period for me right now. We've sold a house in Memphis, we bought one in Melbourne, and we're on the point of moving back. So winning the Nobel Prize does change your life. I mean, you can choose how much it changes your life. Some people spend a year in very intense sort of activity, and then they'll back off from it. And in North America, you can do that. I mean, most of the Nobel Prizes go to the United States. And so you can back off from it if you wish, and you can sort of take things fairly quietly if you want, or you can accept various invitations. But when I move back to Australia later this year, I will be the only Nobel Prize winner in the sciences living in the Southern Hemisphere.
Oh, that's incredible, isn't it?
There are a number of Nobel Prize winners in Peace Prize winners in the Southern Hemisphere, maybe some maybe economics also in South America, but there's no one in the sciences, physics, chemistry, medicine, and so I'll be the only one. And you know, that says something about the distribution of intellectual activity in our world, so to speak, and resources too, for that matter.
You know, I'd just be curious, I'm sure others would too, again, to get back to the thing about occasionally a prophet is not without honour except in his own country, just tell us about some of the things that in fact you did get recognition by the Australians after the Nobel Prize.
Well, after the Nobel Prize, I was, I think, I tried to handle it in a way that would be of value, not from the point of view of publicising myself, but would be actually, I thought, be of value for the broader community, particularly for young people. And one of the things that had upset me very much in Canberra in those days when I was there and trying to change the institution was that the opportunities weren't there for young people, and we were supporting people who were really not doing very good science, or rather mundane science, and not giving chances to bright young people coming along. And of course they all move to the US or get lost. I mean, some of them just go out of science. And so I'm going to try to help sort of maintain the culture where we can, bright young people can hope to spend, after maybe spending some time in the Northern Hemisphere, because it's important to get out of a small country like Australia. It's only 20 million people. At least some of them can have decent careers in Australia in science and in intellectual activity. And I think for society to turn its back on higher education and science and a higher culture in any sense is fatal. And if you do that, you will simply go down as a culture, and you will become just a client state that's simply derivative. And Australia's done better than that in the sciences in the past, and it's done better than that in literature. It's had a very strong literary culture, a very strong art culture, quite respectable music and so forth. And I think it can continue to do that, and anything that I can do personally to help promote that, I will. And the other thing is, of course, Australia is right in that South Pacific region. We are surrounded by countries that are former colonies and have certain negative feelings about European type culture, and Australia still is a predominantly European culture. And we need to build a lot better bridges and a lot more mutual respect and understanding between Australia and those countries. And we have to understand their cultures a little bit better and just be a little more understanding of them, I think. And so I think there's a role to play there as a sort of hopefully a sort of scientific ambassador in some very broad sense, without any formal. So I'm not looking for any, apart from running a research lab, I'm not looking for any formal position or appointment. I just want to try as a private individual to do what I can for those sorts of issues.
Well, has Australia still got aid to a lot of those Southeast Asian countries?
Yes,
they
still
got a pretty
does.
good record of doing things for
Yes, but no good, you know the old saying, no good deed shall go unpunished.
Yes.
And to some extent that's true. I mean, you know, the US saved Britain in the Second World War, but the British have never really forgiven them, and there's a lot of anti-Americanism in some of these societies. So, yeah, I think it's true.
Just tell me, you've talked about the bad time in Canberra and so on, but after the Nobel Prize, you did receive some recognition, I think, from
even before that, the University of Queensland, and this is partly your doing, awarded me an honorary doctorate. They also made me the alumnus of the year in the early, before the Lasker Award, actually. After the Lasker Award, or about that time, the Australian National University, where I worked, awarded honorary doctorates in science to Zinkenagel and to me, and so we were back there getting honorary doctorates of science. There's still a certain tension, I thought, and things had not really changed that much. Lafferty was still the director at the John Curtin School, and he was under severe attack from some of the faculty within it, and it was a bad situation, though he brought in some very good people, and they've subsequently got going very well. And then it was to change. It had started to change, but there was still enormous resistance to change. And now I think things are on the right track.
But the one that I was most impressed by, knowing the relationship that the medicos regarded the veterinarians as in Australia, you were awarded honorary.
I've been made an honorary member of the College of Pathologists of Australia.
I'm impressed.
And an honorary member of the College of Physicians. That doesn't give me any billing rights. No. I can't actually have patients. But in actual fact, the College of Pathologists was quite interested, and it's one of the things I want to talk to them about more. They were wondering whether they shouldn't be trying to develop some sort of veterinary, formal veterinary interaction, in fact. Now, the vets, of course, I think the pathologists are organised into their own college. There's a College of Veterinary Scientists. And so I don't know how much they're interested in becoming involved with the medical pathologists, because their worlds are rather different in a way. I mean, the medical pathologists are concerned a lot about, well, getting the money in and organising these diagnostic labs and all the rest of it, and the vets, I'm not so sure. I think a lot more of the veterinary pathology is now done in sort of contract type labs and so forth as well. But so it's not a world I've had a lot of intimate relationship with, but it was very, very kind of them, and I was very pleased to be made a member of the society. Yeah, it's a sort of a purely honorary thing.
Yes, but I think that's a major breakthrough. Consider the attitude of many years ago.
Well, things have been opening out. I mean, Australia's been a rather conservative society in many ways. As a young country, it was still extremely conservative in many respects. It still is in some ways rather conservative, and but things are changing.
That thing that you described about that there could be a veterinary component in the medical College of Pathologists is really like the British one.
Oh yes,
the Royal College of
that's right.
Pathologists.
That's true.
Who has both membership, both types of membership.
Yeah.
But
well, I've been made a foreign associate of the French Academy of Medicine.
Oh, great.
And that has always had vets and medics in the same organisation, and I think that goes back to Pasteur.
You know, I thought of this. You had mentioned that on one previous occasion, the BCG vaccine. I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce the name of the two people, but the second one, Guerin, I understand was a veterinarian.
Yes, there were several veterinarians who were quite prominent. I think, and I can't actually tell you names. He was, Guerin, I guess.
And I always wondered whether he'd received some of the...
No, and we wondered. I wondered when, actually the word about my being the first vet to win the Nobel Prize really came from the French. The College of Veterinary Medicine in Alfort. Charles Pilet was at that stage either to be president or was president of the Academy of Medicine. A vet was president of the Academy of Medicine, French Academy of Medicine. And I think it was Charles Pilet who got in touch with me and said, we think you're the first vet to win the Nobel Prize. Do you know? And I said, no, I don't. But I thought maybe von Behring or one of the early people was a vet, or had taken a veterinary degree as well as a medical degree. But it turns out none of them did. James Black, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine with Gertrude Elion and Hitchings, taught in a veterinary school. He taught in the Glasgow Veterinary School, but he wasn't a vet, he was a medic. And so it turns out I was the first vet to win the Nobel Prize. Yeah.
So
that's another thing I've got involved in to some extent since then. I've got more involved with the veterinary world again, and I've talked in various formats. And, just a matter of mutual respect, I guess. I mean,
well, there's no question those of us in our profession are incredibly proud of what you've done and how you've carried the banner.
Certainly an odd path to get there.
Well, yes, but it's certainly...
But there have been many veterinarians who have made very substantial contributions in basic medical research.
Right.
And still continue to do so. And one is current is Chris Goodnow at the Australian National University. It's terrific. I mean, great scientist and has done great work. And there've been a number over the years. Yeah.
Actually, even in the States here, there's some of the veterinary pathologists, the ACB veterinary pathologists, have risen to very high ranks in some of the commercial companies in the in molecular stuff.
Yeah.
So I think the situation's changed very drastically.
Yeah. There are Max Essex is professor of I guess public health in Harvard as a vet. I mean, did some of the early important work on AIDS and so forth. I think there've been a number of them over the years.
Well, we're coming down here, but what would you like to say in the last little bit about returning to Australia, the way the family feels?
Well, I think it's time. I'm turning 62 this year. If I'm going to do, I think if I'd stayed in Memphis, the temptation would be to get to age 65 and then quit. I mean, Memphis is fine, but it's not our culture, and we don't really. And though people are very pleasant and so forth, we don't really feel totally at home there. It's very conservative and so forth. And so it's really just been St Jude that's held us there. We sort of feel it's time to go, and we've got grandchildren in Melbourne. We also have grandchildren in Seattle, or a grandchild and another one coming on the way. But our son in Seattle is in academic medicine, and who knows where he'll end up. And so Melbourne is where Penny comes from originally, and it's a good scientific city, and it's just a nice place to be, and there are very good young people, and good young people to work in the research labs and so on. So I'll run a smaller research program there for a while and then do the other things. The other things that I've been doing in Australia have become increasingly exhausting. We haven't had a real vacation now for 5 years. We've had a week here and a few days there and so forth, but we haven't had any really decent vacations. We need a break, and I think it's just time to start to the next phase of my life, which is not retirement, but it's going to be to see what I can do in the Australian scene and to live a more sensible life. I mean, I've just been rushing around, and it's really it's very draining actually in the end.
Actually, in the final few moments, could you just give us some thoughts of what you think about the role or the contribution of veterinary pathology, or how people should think of it, or what it should be doing in the world to come? I mean, it's multifaceted.
Well,
but you must have some.
It's very important, I think, in the sense it takes various forms, veterinary pathology.
Right.
I mean, do we think of someone who does... there's a lot of opportunity for pathology. For instance, all these knockout mice that are being generated where various genes are knocked out, many of them are not worked through properly for pathology or for the physiological basis of the various syndromes they develop. There tends to be a mouse knockout is made by a molecular geneticist. They make a rather crude description of what happens, and then it's not really followed up. So there's a tremendous opportunity there for research-oriented pathologists looking at these animals. Now, there's a problem, I think, in veterinary pathology, and that is to become a veterinary pathologist, you need to do the veterinary pathology boards if you're going to be working and paid well as a veterinary pathologist. The problem with that is that by the time someone has done 4 years of college and 4 years of veterinary school and 3 or 4 years to train for the ACVP, and you've learnt all this material, you're getting on a bit before you do some research, and you've been living in a culture, the ACVP type culture, which has nothing to do with the research. I mean, it's really an enormous body of fact, and that's not a good research precursor. So I wonder, I mean, with the Australian colleges of medicine, physicians, for instance, and the College of Pathologists, you can do some of that, but you don't need to do all of it, and you can spend a couple of years out of those 4 years training doing research. And is there a place for the more research-oriented veterinary pathologists to get some of the basics, but not to know all the details, which presumably a lot of which you can look up somewhere, and to do a more research-type training? Is it possible that some of the veterinary schools might move away from that sort of training and focus much more on a research training? There's nothing original in what I'm saying about this. I heard J.R.M. Innes say it many years ago, the neuropathologist. But I think it somewhat is a problem. And the Brits, for instance, get going very early in their research careers. And we see, you know, often if someone's got their PhD by the time they're 25, 26, they may not have a lot of breadth, but they know how to do research. And so I think that's could be somewhat of a problem. Now, some people that's not going to make a difference, but other people, they're not going to, I mean, they're going to sort of miss that sort of research orientation, I think. Yeah.
The Australian scene is rather grim.
The Australian veterinary scene is very grim.
Well, for veterinary pathologists, it's even grimmer with the big age group now.
Yeah, it's
the age differential.
and really the veterinary education now is underfunded in Australia, as many aspects of education are. The large agricultural industries are very efficient, but they don't lose a lot of veterinary manpower. And so, and there are, whereas when I went through veterinary school, there were 2 veterinary schools in Australia and New Zealand. Now there are 5. And I think there are too many. And if they are going to have that many, and it gets tied up in state politics and university politics. If they are going to have that many, they need to work out some way of networking them much more effectively, so that in effect, those different campuses operated as a national veterinary school. But whether people are willing to put in the money that would be required to do that properly, but I think it's one of the things that might be sort of a test case for Australian education to look at the possibility that you could get a lot more bang for the buck by actually using more modern techniques for communication. And so maybe the veterinary thing would be a good place to start to look at that in the Australian context. But there are clearly too many vet schools in Australia.
Well, we should probably wrap it up. Would you like to make a last couple of statements to the eager young people out there looking at research? And
well, I think also there are a number of things about research. I mean, you know, you don't do research unless that's what turns you on. You've really got to have that curiosity. You've really got to have the drive to try and find something out. And maybe you have to be a little bit neurotic, I mean, in a sense, and to be driven. My friend, I think Cedric Mims, said, the characteristic of the good research worker is they remain perpetual adolescents. And there's some truth in that. You maintain perpetually curious. Now, most people through their lives don't remain curious. In fact, many of them are not curious at all. In fact, if they're Southern Baptists and they go to one of the schools that are driven by those people, any curiosity will be beaten out of them very quickly. But so curiosity is one thing. The other thing is, even though someone might be in their early 30s before they start research, it's not too late. And we've seen that happen over and over, even though with the remarks I made about the ACVP, we've seen that happen over and over with American medical graduates. They've done medicine, a college, medicine, they've done their boards, and then they started to do research in their early 30s, and they've had spectacular careers. So it's never too late. Human beings live a very long time. We actually do live a very long time. A productive life that starts at 35 now might go on for 40 years.
Yeah.
I've been in research for 40 years. I started doing research when I was 22. I've been doing research for 40 years. My first paper was published the first year that they started to produce Index Medicus, 1966. And I don't have one foot in the grave yet, I hope. I mean, I should touch wood, I guess. But so don't be discouraged. I mean, you can do it. And now, with molecular medicine, it doesn't matter whether you're trained as a vet or a doc or a scientist, you can come into it. And with a veterinary training, you know a lot of things that nobody else knows. Yeah. And you understand pathological processes and pathogenesis mechanisms better than anybody else, better than the medicos. You're better trained. And if you come into research, you can do really spectacularly well if you want to do that. But you have to be driven to do it. And it really has to be a passion. It has to be your passion. If you do research and research is not your passion, you shouldn't be doing it.
Well,